Suddenly, the sky became covered with dark clouds, and with a deafening roar, the impregnable tower began to shake, crack, and crumble, plunging everything around into chaos and panic. The bloody swords of the heroes sank deep into the ground, like silent witnesses of their harsh battle. They stood, watching wearily as the majestic tower collapsed with a roar, swallowed by chaos and dust. One of the heroes, without taking his eyes off the collapsing tower, quietly told the other that it was all over. Suddenly, Adam appears from the dust and chaos, leaning on his staff and missing one arm, saying with unshakable confidence in his voice that this is not the end. A figure in a lion-skin cloak emerges from the group of heroes, peering intently at Adam. It was Alec, the hero of Olympus, who told Adam that despite his immortality, such behavior before the external gods was unacceptable. A well-aimed throw of the hand sends the blue sphere towards Adam and Alec. Bob emerged from the shadows, his figure a sharp contrast to the surrounding light. The heroes looked at each other in amazement as they saw Bob emerge from the darkness as a mysterious figure shrouded in mystery. Bob sank down on the rock in dismay, as if the weight of his thoughts had become too much for one person to bear. He, with a heavy sigh, said that he alone survived, thanks to his unbridled strength and unyielding will, despite all the trials and dangers. These words shocked everyone present, causing them to fall silent and stare at Bob. He repeated once again that everyone else was dead, while the color of the throne sphere suddenly changed. The heroes turned to the sphere, from which strange, mystical sounds were heard, forcing them to tense up and listen carefully. A voice from one of the outer gods was heard in this sphere, to which Adam screamed in horror. Bob silently nodded, confirming his words. Bob stood up and sadly declared that they could not defeat the outer gods. Suddenly, a stranger in a long cloak appeared before them, his face hidden in shadow, gesturing for Bob to sit down on the stone, as if his power was weighing heavily upon him. Bob's face expressed despair, and the understanding that there was no other way out but to submit to this method. The stranger turned out to be Kronos, the god of time, and offered Bob to go back in time and start over. Kronos took out his mechanism and pointed it towards Bob, its glowing time indicators blinking mysteriously. Bob peered into the mechanism of Kronos, as if plunging into the depths of time under its hypnotic influence. Looking at everyone else, Bob told them that this was their last chance. Bob was not chosen for this mission by chance. His role was predetermined, said Kronos. Adam was irritated that Bob's selection for this mission was not random, perhaps because it made him feel unfair or undervalued. But Bob was the first one who quickly adapted to the new reality and conditions of this world, so the choice fell on him. Alec approached the hero and sincerely wished him luck in his feat. The rest also expressed their wishes for the hero's success in his mission, filling him with support and inspiration. The Kronos mechanism began to slowly spin in Bob's hand, emitting strange sounds and creating a feeling of unpredictable temporal force around him. The mechanism began to emit a bright light that filled the surrounding space, as if opening a portal to another dimension of time. The hero looked at his hands, illuminated by a bright light, and felt a sense of incredible strength and responsibility for the upcoming task awakening within him. Bob suddenly felt the world around him change, and the next moment he moved out of the light of the Kronos mechanism and took on a normal human appearance. Suddenly, when Bob already felt like an ordinary person, a strong blow flew into his face, making him flinch. Bob realized that Kronos had directed the flow of time through him, and the next moment he found himself a student experiencing his first week at university. Michael stood and smiled, watching the events around him with confidence and goodwill. Michael swung at Bob again, preparing for another blow. But this time, Bob deftly dodged the blow, demonstrating his agility and reaction. Mike swung at Bob again in a rage, aiming his blow with even more force and determination. Bob knocks Michael out with a deft punch, landing a precise and powerful blow that takes him out of the fight. Bob's eyes filled with determination and confidence, reflecting his readiness for any challenges and trials. Bob took his phone out of his pocket and looked at it. The clock showed late, only 9 hours left. The city at night was beautiful. The lights of the skyscrapers twinkled like stars in the sky. The streets were lively and filled with a mysterious charm that can only be felt in the deep silence of the night. The restaurant was filled with people deep in conversation and smiling, enjoying the atmosphere and delicious food, surrounded by pleasant music and warm lighting. Michael was annoyed by the fact that the restaurant was crowded, which prevented him from enjoying the atmosphere and the conversation. But among the crowd of people, he finally saw his friends, and this immediately made his mood better. He walked up to the table where his friends were sitting and grabbed a glass of drink, joining the group with a smile on his face. Michael took a sip of the drink, tasting its warmth and aroma. Then he smiled at his friends and sat down at the table, joining in the general conversation and atmosphere of fun. They began a friendly conversation, full of laughter and pleasant memories, sharing news and discussing plans for the future, enjoying the time spent together. Suddenly, Michael remembered Bob hitting him and was silent for a moment, realizing the past events. Michael became curious about how Bob spent his weekend at the university. Were there any events, studies, or anything unexpected happened? He also remembered how he was bleeding, and this memory caused him to shudder slightly and feel an unpleasant sensation that clouded his current thoughts. But remembering that he was among friends, he relaxed, allowing the warmth of their company and friendly conversation to push away the dark memories. They raised their glasses and clinked them together, enjoying the moment and strengthening their camaraderie. Afterwards, they went outside, enjoying the cool night air and the sounds of the night city, which was full of life and energy. They stood on the street thinking about how else to entertain themselves, their thoughts hovering around various ideas, from going to a nightclub to a night walk in the park. Suddenly, they noticed Bob rolling a suitcase on wheels along the sidewalk. Michael was very surprised by Bob's appearance and frowned a little irritably, not expecting to see him here with a suitcase. They decided to catch up with Bob and say hello to him. Walking quickly along the sidewalk, they caught up with him, and Michael, hiding his irritation, was the first to call out to him. Bob stopped and turned around. Seeing familiar faces, his expression did not change. The hero said with a mysterious smile, "Enjoy it while you can. There is very little time left, the apocalypse will begin soon." Bob took off his watch, threw it next to the suitcase which he placed on the ground, and began to open it. Mike was shocked when he saw what was in the suitcase. The suitcase contained many knives and axes of different shapes and sizes, their blades glittering in the light. Bob took one of the knives in his hand, feeling its weight and sharpness. He took an axe in his other hand, and those around him watched this action in horror. Hanging the axe on his belt and throwing the backpack, which was also in the suitcase, over his shoulder, Bob rose up, holding the knife in his hand. Bob's gaze was indifferent, as if he had already gotten used to the unusual environment and was ready for any trials, since he understood what would begin in the near future. The clock showed almost 12 o'clock, and everything was just beginning. People around began to clutch their heads, sensing the approach of something terrible or unexpected. All over the city, luminous dots began to flash and appear, like stars in the sky. Everyone around them was holding their heads in pain, but Bob was unaffected. Michael, in horror and pain, could not understand what was happening around him. Zombies began to appear on the streets of the city, and those around were shocked by this unexpected and terrible event. There were cries of horror from all sides, but Bob knew that this was possible and was prepared for it. Bob's gaze was determined and prescient. He realized that something was about to begin that would have a strong impact on the world around him. The zombies began to cause chaos around them, sowing terror and chaos among those around them. A crowd of zombies was approaching Bob, and he was preparing for battle. The hero held the knife tightly in his hands, ready to repel any zombie attack. The rest defended themselves with whatever they could, hammers and knives, trying to fight off the advancing zombies. The hero took out a small bottle filled with something unknown and opened it. Bob coated the blade of his knife with an unknown liquid, preparing to use it to fight the zombies. A real meat grinder began. Zombies were attacking from all sides, and the main character and the others fought for their lives, using all available means. The character fought the zombies, fighting them off with weapons in hand and trying to save the survivors in this merciless clash. The zombies fell from the blows of the main character. He chopped and cut them into pieces. It turned out that the world was immersed in the game, and by killing zombies, Bob increased his level. The city streets were teeming with zombies. There was blood and panic everywhere. People were running in terror, trying to survive in this merciless battle for survival. One of the humans was armed with an axe, preparing to fight off the zombies and defend himself in this fight for survival. He struck the zombie with all his might with the axe, trying to disable it and protect himself from the attack. But the zombie responded by attacking the character after receiving the blow. The zombie mercilessly grabbed the character's neck, trying to eat him. Bob realized that defeating zombies required extraordinary strength and strategy. Otherwise, he would not be able to resist them. The main character continued to fight off hordes of zombies, increasing his level. Suddenly, he noticed that the blow to one of the zombies did not cause any damage, which meant that the effect of the liquid he had lubricated the weapon with had ended. The main character quickly jumped back, avoiding the powerful blow of the zombie, who aimed his blow in his direction. Bob put his hand in his pocket to get out another bottle of liquid. The hero threw the bottle into the air and, swinging his knife, cut it in half. The blade was again lubricated with liquid. The main character remembered Jack's words. He told him the secret of how to defeat the first-level zombies. To defeat zombies, You need a solution of salt and water. This is the advice he heard from Jack. The mysterious liquid turned out to be a saline solution. Bob continued to fight the zombies. Bob earned an in-game achievement for killing zombies quickly and now had 3 skills to choose from. The main character began to carefully study the available skills, evaluating their advantages and disadvantages in order to choose the most useful ones for further battles. But not finding anything useful at the moment, the hero decided to save skill points for the future. The zombies were approaching Bob, their muffled groans and shuffling footsteps filling the street. Suddenly, the hero heard a loud sound that echoed through the street, attracting the attention of both him and the zombies. Someone tried to stab the zombie, waving a knife and making loud noises in an attempt to fight back. It was Michael, who was fighting furiously with the zombies, waving his weapon and trying to fight off the attacking undead. But Michael wasn't doing much. His blows did almost no damage to the zombies. He desperately kicked the zombie, trying to push it away and buy himself some time. Michael then began to run with his friends, desperately trying to find a safe place to hide. Michael's friends were terrified by the number of zombies surrounding them on all sides, and panic gripped them. The zombies were gaining on them, their muffled groans and relentless advance drawing ever closer. Michael swung his knife, going for a decisive blow, hoping to stop at least some of the zombies. But at the most critical moment, Michael's weapon broke. The knife blade crumbled in his hands, and the character, looking desperately at the useless fragment, thought that the end had come for him. The zombie approached Michael and extended its decomposed hand towards him, slowly and ominously reaching towards his face. Suddenly, something struck the zombie. He suddenly stopped, and with a dull groan began to fall to the ground. All the zombies fell to the ground from the action of the strange dust flying in the air. White dust rained down from above, slowly settling on the ground as the zombies, drained of their strength, lay on the asphalt. Michael carefully tasted the white dust, and noticing its strange, slightly salty texture, he guessed that it was salt. It turned out that it was Bob who scattered salt into the air, creating an effect that paralyzed the zombies and stopped their advance. Bob stopped to assess how many zombies had died from the spilled salt. It turned out that the salt had destroyed all the zombies. The main character threw his backpack over his shoulder and, having made sure that everything was safe, was about to move on. A voice from nowhere congratulated everyone on their survival, its words echoing through the empty streets. People did not understand what was happening. Their faces expressed complete confusion and bewilderment. The voice continued to speak, explaining the basic mechanics of the game, controls, and item usage. The voice also explained how to trade in this game world, how to find merchants, how to exchange resources and items. Bob, confirming the words of the voice, was about to leave, confidently heading deeper into the city. Suddenly, a second wave began in the city, and the streets were once again filled with the roar of footsteps and inhuman groans, bringing back chaos and danger. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate, foreshadowing the approach of a new threat. Michael put his hand to his head, feeling the tension and confusion take hold of him. The character didn't understand where Bob had gone, his gaze darting around the surrounding panic and chaos. Michael and his friends tried to find Bob in the crowd, through the panicked screams and fuss looking for him. Suddenly they noticed him. Bob was walking through the crowd, confident and determined, as if he knew the exact direction and goal. Michael rushed to catch up with the main character, making his way through the crowd. The character grabbed Bob by the shoulder, stopping his movement, and told him he was going the wrong way. Michael wanted Bob to go with them, insistently saying so. But Bob, with a determined look on his face, replied that he knew where he had to go and did not want to join Michael. The hero advised Michael to find a safe area and hide there while he continued on his way. Bob added that Michael should avoid arrogance and not underestimate the danger. Michael was furious and was about to stab Bob in the back. Clenching his fist and unable to contain his irritation, Michael was ready to strike. But Michael was stopped by strange sounds coming from the darkness. These were rustlings and muffled groans. The character quickly decided to hide in a safe zone, realizing that a new threat was approaching. Suddenly, something from underground grabbed one of the people, tearing him out of the crowd with great force. Michael was horrified, his eyes widened in fear when he saw this. A huge worm burst out of the ground and swallowed the man whole, leaving behind only torn-up earth and momentary silence. Bob, seeing what had happened, did not lose his composure and dealt a powerful blow to the worm, trying to rip its jaws apart and drive the creature away. The protagonist, gathering all his strength, delivered a decisive blow and cut the worm in half, causing it to vomit green slime and scraps of flesh. Bob heard cries for help coming from the streets and from somewhere far away. He needed to move on and go down into the subway, despite the agonizing screams and the urgent desire to help. He could barely contain himself and for a moment was ready to go to help, but he changed his mind. The hero found himself below, where it was dark all around and oppressive darkness enveloped the entire space. Worms began to emerge from the darkness, their writhing bodies crawling in every direction, and Bob, armed with a knife and an axe, entered the fray. Bob dealt with the worms, methodically and decisively hacking at them until their torn bodies littered the ground around him. The hero's level increased, and Bob, despite fatigue and stress, remained calm. Bob continued his descent into the depths of the subway, making his way through darkness and debris. The hero came to a certain place and got ready, carefully examining the surrounding area. The subway was crawling with worms, their writhing bodies filling the tunnels, creating a horrible picture of decay and chaos. The walls were covered in slime, and a foul smell and rustling sounds filled the air. The worms sensed Bob. Their receptors picked up his presence. They began to move and wriggle, rushing towards him. Bob prepared for the upcoming battle. He stood in a fighting stance, holding his weapon tightly. The protagonist took out a second knife, carefully removed it from its sheath and confidently gripped a blade in each hand. The worm opened its huge mouth, its teeth like sharp fangs glinting in the dim light. Bob launched an attack, rushing forward with lightning speed, his knives slashing sharply and precisely at the writhing worms, aiming for their vulnerable spots. There was a spray of slime as Bob's knives sank into the worm's flesh, tearing it and causing the green mass to fly apart. Suddenly, a bead, sparkling with a bright light, flew out of one of the worms and hung in the air, emitting powerful energy waves. Bob was surprised to find that these beads could be collected right there. The hero quickly picked up the bead, its soft glow illuminating his hand. Bob decided that all the worms needed to be destroyed in order to collect more beads. Meanwhile, chaos reigned in the streets. The worms continued to attack. People screamed and panicked, cars were overturned. And those who were in the safe zone began to study the mechanics of the game. They carefully looked through the instructions. The safe zone began to shrink little by little, its borders gradually narrowing. People started getting randomly ejected from the safe zone. Many people found themselves outside the safe zone and were soon engulfed in chaos. They were immediately attacked by worms, these terrible creatures, sensing new prey, quickly wriggled and attacked. The worms ate more and more people, devouring their bodies with a terrible greed, their huge mouths filled with sharp teeth, capturing and tearing people apart. People began to panic when, faced with the incessant attacks of worms, they began to fight among themselves. They tried to run, desperately searching for any shelter or safe place. Michael, overcome with despair, shouted for everyone to shut up. People turned towards him, stopping their shouts and fights, their faces distorted with fear and fatigue. Michael said with fury in his voice that now they had to choose who would die in his place. So that he could get out of here and survive, his words hung in the air like a threat. Michael grabbed one of the poor guys by the chest, his eyes burning with a mad fire, saying, "I'm going to kill this old man." He held him as if he was the only barrier between him and survival. Meanwhile, Bob continued to fight the worms, and there was not a moment's rest in his actions. Bob attacked and defended at the same time. His movements were flawlessly honed. The worms kept crawling and crawling. Their number seemed endless. They were stretching out from all the cracks and crevices, their writhing bodies filling the space. Finally, Bob had killed all the worms, his weapon still glinting in the dim light, covered in blood and slime. The hero, wiping sweat and blood from his face, bent over the bodies of the fallen worms and began to collect the scattered beads into a bag. There was a terrible stench coming from the decomposing bodies of worms. Finally, Bob decided to distribute the experience points he had accumulated during the battle. Bob spent all his experience points on increasing his mana. The hero continued his journey deeper, confident in his new powers. Suddenly, Bob turned around, feeling that someone was watching him. Someone was watching him from a hole in the ceiling, a shadow flickering in the dark opening, giving away the hidden observer. Bob asked into the darkness, "Who are you?" His voice full of alertness and his gaze directed straight into the hole. Suddenly, Ava appeared from the hole looking like a small doll. Ava, the skill merchant, noted with a slight laugh that Bob was the first customer, and her eyes lit up with interest. Bob decided to see what Ava had to offer. The hero began to study with interest her range of skills that she was ready to sell. The range was vast, and it took Bob time to thoroughly study all the skills on offer. But Bob couldn't find what he really needed and was afraid of attracting attention. But still, the main character decided to buy the skill of monkey eyes and the skill of enveloping the sword with mana. Ava thanked for the purchase and decided to leave. Bob prepared to move on, leaving behind a mountain of dead worms, their chopped-up bodies lying haphazardly on the tunnel floor. Suddenly, the hero became thoughtful. His gaze clouded over and he froze for a moment. He remembered the words of Kronos, who told him about the importance of time and that every decision made could change the future. After considering Kronos' words, Bob took a deep breath, collected his thoughts, and resolutely moved further down the tunnel. More worms awaited Bob ahead, their ominous shapes gleaming in the dim light. The worms ate the people they had caught above, their jaws crunching as they tore through the flesh, creating terrifying sounds. The creatures sensed Bob and their heads turned towards him, hissing menacingly. Bob prepared to attack, his hands gripping his weapon tightly and his eyes focused. The protagonist decided to use a new skill, activating the monkey eyes and the sword with mana. Suddenly, the main boss, a massive creature with a terrifying appearance, appeared from a pile of worms. The hero deftly repelled the attacks of the worms. His movements were fast and precise. The boss let out a deafening scream that shook the air and caused Bob's body to tremble. The large worm headed towards Bob, opening its huge mouth, ready to swallow him whole. The main character deftly jumped into the air, avoiding the capture of the worm's giant mouth, and flew over its head. Bob was about to attack the worm, his weapon ready to deliver the finishing blow to the giant enemy's vulnerable spot. The hero was already anticipating victory. His face was tense but determined, and he concentrated on the final, powerful blow. Bob struck, and green goo squirted out of the worm's wound. The protagonist took the axe in his second hand, preparing to continue the attack. Bob swung with both weapons at once, his knife and axe meeting head-on with the worm's skin. A slight smile appeared on Bob's face as he realized that the worm, which had been hit by his blows, was beginning to show signs of weakness. The hero delivers more blows, each of which is precise and powerful. Slime sprayed everywhere, covering the surface of the tunnel. Bob's new skill, Monkey Eyes, kicked in, and his vision became incredibly sharp, allowing him to spot the worm's smallest movements. Bob used the skill on his sword again, its blade sparkling with new, magical energy, increasing its sharpness and strength. The protagonist and the worm clashed in a decisive confrontation. Bob's eyes glowed with a bright, piercing light, reflecting his concentration. Meanwhile, the man grabbed his leg. He realized that he was wounded and could not continue to fight. Michael threatened the man, his voice filled with anger and tension as he shouted. The character pointed his knife towards the man, his hand shaking with rage. Michael screamed that the man must die in his place. Michael's face was angry, his features twisted in an expression of rage and despair as he looked at the man. The safe zone gradually shrank, and the man remained outside of it, desperately trying to break through. The people in the safe zone were in complete horror as they watched Michael brutally push the man away. Suddenly, a loud countdown was heard, echoing throughout the safe zone. The last 3 seconds were flashing on the timer screen. The timer suddenly stopped at the last second, and those around him froze in anticipation. Michael was full of surprise and bewilderment. In the subway, Bob, exhausted after fighting the main worm, sat on the carcass of a huge monster. Ava, watching Bob, circled around him in delight, her eyes wide with surprise. The character offered Bob a special reward for the early destruction of the Great Worm. Ava gave Bob a choice of 3 rewards, each of which held unique abilities and powers. Bob was a little confused by the choice of the offered rewards, not knowing which one to choose. The protagonist thought that communication with Olympus would not be useful to him at the moment, and decided to postpone this choice. But Ava began to describe in detail all the delights and advantages of choosing a connection with Olympus, trying to convince Bob of its benefits. But Bob resolutely refused, preferring to focus on his current goals and chose simple rewards. Ava tried again to convince Bob, describing how his connection to Olympus could be his key to power. But Bob didn't want to listen to her and resolutely jumped off the worm's corpse. The hero decided that it was time to call the distributor for a meeting. A huge, powerful man with a massive build and a stern look appeared before the hero. His powerful body and confident posture showed that he was more than just a manager. Duke, impressed by Bob's ability to summon him to a meeting, asked with interest how he had learned this rare skill. Bob replied that he knew about the first rule that Duke had introduced and used it to call him to the meeting. Duke stood silently, watching Bob intently, without saying a word. Duke became very interested. Bob complained to Duke about Ava, explaining that she had offered him a connection to Olympus, which he did not want. This enraged Duke and he struck Ava with fury. Duke slapped Ava and, shaking his hand, looked at Bob with a cold gaze. Bob decided to ask for a reward, explaining that he expected to be fairly compensated for his determination and strength in the fight against the worms. Duke said he had an idea, but still. He narrowed his eyes thoughtfully, his gaze becoming suspicious. Duke, curious and suspicious, leaned closer to Bob and asked how one participant had managed to kill so many worms on his own. Bob coldly replied that it was none of his business. Duke, without looking away, extended his hand to Bob, expecting him to accept his offer. The protagonist looked closely at Duke's outstretched hand. Bob reached out and accepted the award from Duke, feeling his heart beat faster in anticipation. A magical light enveloped him, raising the hero's mana level. Duke nodded to Bob, confirming that the award had been given, and with a barely perceptible grin, he turned around. A magical light surrounded him, and he disappeared. Bob was left alone among the dead worms, their decomposed bodies a reminder of the recent battle. The main character was surprised by the reward. He did not expect to receive such a boost so early. Bob was able to create a glowing sphere in his hand that emitted a powerful stream of energy. The hero attempted to use the sphere, but it proved unstable and, emitting a bright burst of energy, shattered into pieces, leaving him surrounded by debris and sparks. However, Bob was glad, realizing that this was only the beginning. A new wave of worms began to approach Bob, their sinister bodies covered in slime and moving with an eerie hissing sound. Bob entered the fray again, his determined gaze sweeping over the crawling worms. Meanwhile, a heated argument broke out in the safe zone, and the people in the confined space began to quarrel. People in the safe zone continued to panic and feel fear, their tension and anxiety only increasing. Michael grabbed the other unfortunate man by the lapels again. The face was distorted with rage and despair. The character, squeezing the poor fellow by the chest, looked at him with an icy expression on his face, full of despair and cruelty. Bob's figure appeared from afar, illuminated by the dim light of the crumbling city. People who saw Bob in this state thought he might be crazy. Suddenly, a huge worm burst out from under the ground and quickly attacked Bob. The worm opened its huge mouth again, aiming at Bob, ready to swallow him whole. Bob jumped up and, using his new skill, attacked the worm from above with a running start. Splashes of green slime, accompanied by loud splashes, reached the people. Michael was surprised to watch Bob fight the huge worm with determination. Bob's face was stern, determined and focused. Bob walked up to Michael, leaving behind the worm's mangled body in the slime-strewn streets. Michael brushed the remaining dust and mucus from his face and hugged Bob tightly. The rest, breathing a sigh of relief, took out knives and food that they were able to store in the safe zone. While the rest of the people were busy organizing their provisions, Michael and Bob found a corner where they could talk without interruption. The protagonist accused Michael of using the help of others while Bob risked his life and fought the worms. Bob said it was very strange that Michael ignored real threats and relied on others for help. Michael became furious at Bob's accusations and began to threaten him. The character angrily explained to Bob that people were bringing him food because he had become their only leader and savior in this chaos. Bob was not interested in listening to Michael's excuses and turned to leave, ignoring his attempts to explain the situation. Michael threatened Bob that if he didn't stay, he would definitely regret it. But Bob, ignoring Michael's threats, continued on his way, deciding not to waste time on useless conflicts. Suddenly, strange creatures began to crawl from the dark corners of the city, their writhing bodies and creepy faces covering the walls of buildings. A new wave began. Spiders and zombies filled the streets of the city. Their clusters covered the ground. The streets were crawling with zombies and spiders, crawling out of every nook and cranny, filling the city with endless streams, looking for any living thing. The people, having gathered their last strength, armed themselves with everything they could find, knives and axes. Michael noticed a narrow passage between the ruins that could be his only chance for salvation. Bob suddenly began shaking beads out of his bag, causing confusion and wariness among everyone around him. The creatures were crawling out of the subway and were rapidly approaching. The zombies emitted terrible groans, their voices echoing through the streets. Concentrating, Bob used his new skill, creating a glowing sphere in his hand. The entire subway was illuminated by a bright blue light that emanated from the sphere in Bob's hand, frightening the creatures and zombies. The hero prepared to strike, concentrating all his power into the shining blue sphere. The hero struck with the sphere, and a powerful wave of energy blew the creatures and zombies to pieces, filling the metro with thick clouds of blue glow. Bob was surprised by the power of the skill as the blue sphere tore apart an entire wave of creatures and zombies in front of him. Sitting down for a moment, the main character decided to rest. After a while, he began to collect the beads that had fallen from the destroyed monsters, carefully collecting each one. The surviving rats trembled in fear, hiding and watching. Around the hero lay pieces of monsters, torn and covered in slime. Bob pulled out his knife, preparing for the next encounter, waiting tensely. Meanwhile, a group of 3 people carefully moved through the subway. Ethan and John were deciding where to go next, discussing possible routes. Suddenly, Claire noticed something. It made her alert and look more closely. She drew the attention of the others. Claire pointed to a convenience store at the end of the tunnel and said that perhaps shelter or food could be found there. John was delighted and hurried to the store, thinking that it might be a safe place where they could find supplies and rest from danger. Suddenly, a huge spider loomed over John and he froze, preparing to attack. The spider bit Jack on the head with a terrible sound, and blood sprayed in all directions. Ethan and Claire watched in horror as the giant spider ripped John's head off. His body no longer moved, but blood continued to ooze from the wound. The spider was finishing off his head and creatures were crawling out from different sides. The heroes, with shaking hands, took out their weapons, their faces pale with fear. A huge rat, as if from the depths of a nightmare, emerged from the darkness and was rapidly approaching Claire. Claire quickly came to her senses and, grabbing the weapon, delivered a decisive blow. One of the rats, large and vicious, sank its sharp teeth into Claire's hand. At this time, Ethan was completely focused on fighting the zombies that began to surround him and Claire. The zombie suddenly grabbed Ethan's arm, its sharp claws and teeth biting into the skin. Claire was struggling to fight off the rats that were following her, trying to devour her, and a huge spider was approaching them. The rat jumped towards Claire, trying to eat her. Suddenly, something cut the rat in half, scattering blood and meat everywhere. Claire stood there, covered in blood, not understanding what had happened. Bob, with an annoyed expression on his face, told Claire and Ethan that they had woken him up while he was enjoying his soda. The main character, in front of Claire, irritably threw a can of soda at the monsters, and the zombie, having been hit by the can, instantly lost his head, which flew off to the side. Bob pulled out his knife and prepared for the next attack. The hero, using the knife with skill, began to chop up the monsters one after another, their bodies flying into pieces. The last one Bob finished off was a giant spider, which, despite its menacing form, fell to the powerful blows. All the monsters were destroyed, and silence once again enveloped the abandoned subway tunnels. Bob looked at Claire and Ethan, their faces covered in blood and fear. Claire and Ethan thanked Bob for saving them, wiping the blood from their faces and trying to catch their breath. Ethan, badly wounded, fell to his knee, stifling a groan of pain. The protagonist threw them some ointment and told Ethan to treat the wound. Claire caught the ointment and thanked Bob again. Bob added that the ointment needed to be applied as quickly as possible, otherwise Ethan would not be able to use his hand. The hero thought to himself that he had only slept 6 hours, but he wanted more. He had been fighting for a long time and felt very tired. That's why he decided to rest and didn't think that anyone would disturb him. Claire asked if Bob hunted there regularly and if they could join him. The protagonist looked at Claire and Ethan, who were sitting on the floor trying to cope with the shock and injuries. Bob invited Claire and Ethan to go hunting with him. After some time, they arrived at a place that looked more like a cave, with stone walls hidden in the depths. Bob told them to get ready because there was a monster waiting for them ahead. There was a deafening roar that made the walls of the cave shake and echoed off the stone walls. Ethan and Claire were frightened. Their faces turned pale with fear. Bob stopped and, looking at Ethan and Claire, asked warily, "Where is the guarantee that I won't kill you?" The heroes were a little confused, not knowing how to answer Bob's unexpected question. The main character continued, saying that maybe he wanted to take their essences. Bob continued, "Even if I don't kill you, you'll still die here." Claire thought it was strange. Why would Bob invite them along if he had such intentions? And then, Claire asked what Bob wanted from them. The hero said that he needed their help, and if they succeeded, he would share the entities with them in half. Suddenly, a huge snake appeared and opened its mouth, preparing to attack. Ethan started screaming and running to distract the huge snake. The character recalled Bob's words before the battle, when he spoke about the importance of tactics and teamwork. Ethan continued to run, maneuvering and luring the snake behind him to distract its attention. The snake was about to swallow Ethan when Bob suddenly appeared. The hero plunged the knife straight into the snake's mouth, and blood gushed out. Bob then headed towards the lizard, trying not to miss the moment and not give it the opportunity to attack. Bob dealt a decisive blow to the lizard. The hero continued to mercilessly chop the lizard, tearing it into pieces. Ethan watched in amazement as Bob destroyed the lizard with incredible speed and skill. Pieces of the monsters flew in all directions as Bob fought, and soon the entire floor was littered with scraps of flesh and blood. Beads began to emerge from the torn bodies and fell to the ground. Ethan, still impressed by Bob's skill, quickly set about collecting beads so as not to miss a single one. The protagonist, after making sure that the monsters were destroyed, approached Ethan and began collecting beads with him. Bob, covered in blood and with a burnt-out look and a tired expression. Ethan looked at Bob, again convinced that his strength and skill were impressive. The main character asked how many entities had dropped. Ethan told Bob that 6 entities had dropped out, so Bob allowed Ethan to keep one. Ethan asked Bob what his level was. Bob replied that his level was no longer increasing, and Ethan was amazed by this. The protagonist advised Ethan not to ask about levels and skills, as this is personal information. Ethan remembered Bob asking him about endurance, to which Bob replied that it was something else. Bob also gave advice that you need to not only collect essences, but also level up to become stronger. Suddenly Claire appeared, with a pack of monsters chasing her. Ethan tensed a little, but Bob was pleased, preparing for another battle. At the same time, Bob walked towards Claire, preparing to help her. Ethan also joined the battle and began fighting with a hammer, hoping to level up. During the battle, Claire and Ethan's levels increased. Bob asked if they were done fighting. The protagonist reached for the entity that was lying on the ground. Taking the essence, Bob handed it to Claire, saying that it was her reward for helping her. Bob also thanked them for their help, noting that now the hunt will be twice as productive thanks to their efforts. The hero headed towards the exit, saying that they needed to get to the surface. Ethan and Claire were glad that they would be able to go to the surface and find out what was going on there. The portal on the city street turned scarlet, which meant that they would soon open. The two men standing in the shadows exchanged quick phrases, their eyes sparkling with cunning and confusion. Their interest in Michael was clearly wary and calculating. With a decisive step, Michael, noticing their attention, headed towards them. Both looked at Michael with curiosity. Their faces remained wary. They were clearly already preparing for the conversation. Michael's voice was indifferent. He asked where they had been because he had not seen them for a long time. The hero noticed that the faces of the people in front of him tensed up. They were clearly not happy with his appearance. Michael looked at both of them and said that with the opening of the gates, blood will be shed. I know how to solve the situation, Michael said confidently, and offered a survival plan. The price was too high, the character in the gray jacket thought to himself. They wouldn't be able to collect that many entities. He clenched his fist in anger and the absurdity of the demand. Michael offered to give him 400, and then he would think about solving the problem. Then he thought to himself that if these two refused, then a massacre would begin. Everyone around froze, feeling the growing tension. Everyone was waiting for an answer, as if this moment could decide the fate of everyone present. Suddenly, Claire and Ethan emerged from the crowd. The character in the gray jacket was surprised to see Bob following Claire and Ethan. Bob was carrying some kind of box in his hands, attracting everyone's attention. Michael asked where he had been. Bob replied that he had been doing some business and put the box down on the ground. Bob's gaze was firm and serious as he looked around at everyone gathered. Bob opened the box full of glowing entities and showed them to everyone gathered. People gasped when they saw how many entities were in the box. Michael, stunned, asked exactly how many entities were there, to which Bob calmly replied, more than 1,000. How did that son of a bitch collect so much? Michael thought to himself. Michael figured out how many people he had behind him, and that together they could take everything from Bob. Bob began to speak. Do not think that you will be able to take these entities from me. Any attempt will cost you your life. Michael paused, looking at what Bob had shown him. You need these entities, and I have them in abundance, Bob continued. People began to scream and ask for the essences to be given to them, their voices overlapping each other in a chaotic chorus of indignation. He drew a circle around himself, sitting confidently inside it, and announced, I have an offer for you. I am willing to exchange each essence for 100 skill points. That is my price. Everyone started counting their points to figure out how profitable it would be for them to exchange essences for skill points. Michael pulled out a knife and pointed it towards Bob, holding it confidently in his hand. His voice became cold and hard as he asked what if he had nothing to pay with, to which the main character replied that he was not forcing them to buy it. Listen here, son of a bitch. If you think you can manipulate us that easily, I'm here to remind you who really has the power here, Michael said. Ethan and Claire reacted immediately to Michael's threat. They reminded him who killed their friend and why they ran away from Michael in the subway. Both heroes stood next to Bob, demonstrating their readiness to protect him at any cost, despite the danger. Michael, holding back his rage, laughed and said that there are only 3 of you. What can you do against this whole crowd and my people? The character, feeling the growing tension and seeing his authority beginning to waver, shouted, Kill them all, no compromise. A couple of people who were trying to surround Bob were rapidly approaching. The hero pulled out a knife. His movements were lightning fast. He cut off the heads of 2 attackers with one precise blow. Michael was horrified to see Bob dispatch the 2 attackers with ease and determination. The others, seeing this, did not dare to approach him. With confused faces and whispering, they began to retreat. Michael remembered Bob's words when he suggested exchanging essences for skill points. Bob reiterated that buying entities was their choice, but if anyone crossed the line for any other purpose, he would kill them without a second thought. Bob's gaze was hard and there was an unwavering determination in his eyes. Michael again ordered Bob to be killed, and the crowd again headed towards Bob. The main character was left with no other choice. He had to fight. He swung his knife resolutely, cutting off heads and repelling attacks. A mountain of bodies formed around Bob, and blood spattered wildly. Full of rage, Michael, deciding that he would set an example for the others, grabbed a knife. Wanting to end this battle once and for all, Michael charged at Bob, fury in his eyes. Bob prepared to attack, his hands ready for a decisive counterblow. Bob's eyes gleamed with determination as he watched Michael rush towards him. Michael thought for a moment, realizing that his determination could cost him his life. But it was too late. The main character cut off his head with one decisive blow. There were dead bodies lying around Bob, and blood formed pools on the ground. Bob picked up the box of entities that was lying on the ground. The character in the gray jacket stood in shock. He thought to himself how Bob could defeat so many people. He shouted that he was ready to buy the entities. The character decided to sell his sword for skill points, and then use those points to buy an essence. He thought again and headed towards Bob. Bob was about to enter the portal, but he put the box on the ground. The protagonist turned to the approaching man, ready to listen to his proposal. The man in the jacket, with an insistent expression on his face, extended his hand to Bob to begin bargaining. He asked Bob for 7 entities. Bob, shaking hands with the man in the jacket, agreed to the deal, exchanging 7 entities. The crowd watched the deal closely, estimating how many skill points each person had and whether they would have enough for the essences. The man in the jacket quickly entered the portal, leaving the others to collect their skill points. Part of the crowd moved towards Bob, holding out their hands and shouting out their suggestions. The rest began to call for the sixes to quickly sell their weapons. There was a stir all around. People crowded around, noisily discussing deals and trying to be the first to receive the valuable reward. Bob continued to sell essences, making clever deals and quickly exchanging essences for skill points. Some tried to offer Bob unfavorable deals, but he agreed because he understood that the skill points would be useful to him in the future. The main character thought about it and realized that everything was still working out well for him. After counting his skill points, Bob realized that he had enough. "Where should Bob go next?" Claire asked him. The protagonist looked at Claire and Ethan surprised, asking why they hadn't left this place yet, considering that the box was already empty and he was about to enter the portal. Claire and Ethan told Bob that they planned to go with him. The main character replied that he was not going to go into the portal. His plans had changed. He picked up the pouch from the ground, preparing for his next move. There are no more entities, and he needs to get himself some. Claire and Ethan were surprised by this. The hero shook the pouch, making sure that there were no more entities left inside. He threw the empty pouch, which fell to the ground with a dull thud. The heroes looked at Bob and did not understand why he did not leave some of the entities for himself. Ethan decided to ask why Bob didn't keep some for himself, but sold it all. Bob explained that even though he had no intention of going into the portal, Ethan and Claire should take the opportunity to go there, as it could greatly increase their chances of survival. Ethan and Claire thanked Bob for his help and support. Afterwards, they said goodbye to him and headed towards the portal to take advantage of the opportunity. Bob was thinking about his next steps, planning how he could use his resources and skills. The protagonist turned around and saw a man in an exhausted state running up to him. The stranger asked if he was still selling entities, but Bob replied that the trade was over, and the stranger screamed. The stranger fell to one knee, his eyes full of despair. There was a loud roar, and the remaining people grabbed their heads. The hero hurried along the alley, trying to stay away from the crowded square and its remaining people. Bob decided to summon the 6 and acquire items that might be needed for the upcoming trials. The main character was surprised when the manager himself came to his call. The hero asked why he came himself, because he needed a simple store. The manager explained that there were problems with the 6s and decided to personally come to Bob. The work of the 6s was also suspended due to Bob's actions, the manager added. When everyone in the place started calling the flunkies and selling them their weapons, the situation became quite tense, the manager continued. It was because of this that the manager himself decided to come in to establish order and regulate the flow of transactions, which had become unpredictable and chaotic. Bob looked at the manager and said expectantly, "Please open the store. I want to buy some items and upgrades." The main character looked persistently. He did not want to continue the dialogue so as not to attract attention. The steward raised his hand and it lit up with a bright light. The character prepared to open the store. His hand began to slowly descend. "Well, choose," he said, stepping aside. Bob looked carefully at the objects, trying to find something that would help him. The protagonist chose a new sword. It was light and perfectly balanced. In addition to the sword, the hero chose a red robe and a shield. His hand grasped the hilt confidently, as if it had been made especially for him, the gleam of the blade reflecting determination. The manager, having assessed Bob's choice, nodded and said that now no one will be able to touch you. He added that this only applied to the participants, which surprised Bob. At that very moment, the manager disappeared, leaving Bob standing in the alley. The protagonist heard the countdown sound and raised his head up. Filling everything around with an ominous scarlet light, the sky turned fiery. Bob thought to himself that he hadn't seen such a fiery sky in a long time. When the hero came out of the alley, people began to run away in panic, leaving behind only traces of chaos and haste. One of the people, unable to withstand the scorching heat, fell to the ground, sweating and screaming in pain. Bob looked at the fallen man, sympathy flashing in his eyes. At that very second, a fireball fell on the man, burning him instantly and leaving only ashes on the ground. The protagonist dodged the fireball to avoid it and glanced at the street. The street was engulfed in flames. Tongues of flame opened up and mercilessly devoured everything around. A skeletal hand emerged from the ground, slowly reaching out from under the ash and debris. Following the hand, a skeleton with fiery eyes that glowed brightly emerged from under the ground. Suddenly, a crowd of skeletons began to rise from the ground, their bony bodies creaking and rustling. Bob gripped the hilt of his new sword tightly and assumed a fighting stance. As the hero looked towards the horizon, he noticed that behind the skeletons bursting out of the ground, a more impressive figure was emerging. It was a huge fiery silhouette, shrouded in smoke and surrounded by a gloomy light. From the darkness, against the backdrop of blazing lights and developing tongues of flame, a demon with huge, sparkling eyes emerged. Bob said, clutching the sword in his hands and looking straight at the demon. Finally, here you are? The demon's silhouette was huge and fiery, its sinister eyes boring into Bob and hot tongues of flame bursting from its body tore through the air around it. The demon noticed that Bob had interesting monkey eyes, and his voice echoed in the air like a clap of thunder. There was a piercing roar, and the demon, pointing at Bob, ordered the skeletons to attack. The demon pulled out a huge fiery sword. It emitted bright flames and an ominous light. The skeletons, animated by the demon, walked towards Bob, their bony bodies creaking and crunching with every step. Feeling a flow of magic and energy concentrated in his body, Bob, swinging his new sword, quickly began to fight the advancing skeletons. Skeletons crumbled like sand under Bob's blows, his sword flashing blue as it swept through the ranks of his opponents. The demon slammed his fiery sword into the ground, creating a shockwave that tore through the ranks of skeletons and spread across the streets. The demon's fiery eyes flashed with displeasure. He was surprised that Bob had not suffered damage from the devastating attack. The cloud of smoke slowly dissipated. The protagonist stood unharmed, his new cape protecting him perfectly from the fire. Sitting on a raised platform, the demon's fiery eyes watched the battle closely as the skeletons continued their relentless attacks on Bob. He thought about it, watching Bob's tireless resistance. Bob, with an unyielding expression on his face, told the demon that he had come here to hunt him. The hero's eyes lit up with a bright light. He got ready. The hero jumped up, as if preparing for the decisive leap. But he was immediately thrown back by the demon's shockwave. Flames filled the street, consuming everything around in fiery chaos. Bob made his way through the wall of fire, getting closer to the demon with every step. The main character covered himself with a shield that could withstand explosions and flames. When the flames died down, Bob stood there, ashes flying past him. The skeletons continued to advance, pushing through the rubble and ash despite the destruction and flames they left behind. Bob noticed that his shield was worn out from constant impacts and explosions. Its protective properties were significantly reduced. "Surtur, stop dragging it out! Let's fight already!" he shouted to the demon. The demon began to descend from above, making a trembling sound. Bob, looking at the demon, exclaimed, "You are causing tyranny by sending your servants against peaceful people and destroying this city." Surtur, brandishing his fiery sword, pointed it at Bob and said, "You insolent mortal." The protagonist, scratching his ear and showing no fear, replied, "You may be powerful, but I will still kill you." The demon became enraged, his fiery eyes blazing brighter. Surtur swung his sword, tearing through the air and causing a powerful shockwave that was capable of destroying everything in its path. Bob covered himself with his shield to protect himself from the powerful demonic blow. The sword touched the shield and a deafening sound like a thunderclap was heard, filling the air with vibrations. The hero's shield shattered into pieces under the powerful blow. sparks and debris flying in all directions. Bob quickly dodged the next blow, sliding to the side. The demon's sword struck the ground with an enraged roar. The demon, seeing how Bob dodged the blow, anticipated his victory, his eyes blazing with rage and confidence in victory. Surtur, seeing how Bob dodged the blow, began to suspect that he had deliberately exposed himself to the attack. The hero knelt before the demon, his breathing heavy and his face covered in dust and blood. Surtur looked at him with disdain and curiosity. "You're causing too much harm and it has to end," Bob said. Surtur continued to stare at Bob in the silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Bob stood surrounded by a wall of flames, and the demon continued to watch him. Suddenly the hero, clenching his teeth, quickly grabbed the sword. He raised it, and the bright light from the blade tore through the darkness around. "You think you can defeat me with this sword?" Surtur said mockingly. Bob suddenly bit into the ice crystal he had purchased from the steward. The demon looked at the ice crystal in confusion, realizing that its firepower no longer mattered. The demon struck instantly, but Bob managed to activate another ice crystal. Now Bob was not taking damage from the high heat, and when their swords touched, sparks flew in all directions. The demon was surprised to see how his powerful blow failed to penetrate Bob's defense. Bob blocked the demon's sword, and he used that moment to counterattack. The hero jumped up, trying to deliver the finishing blow. The demon, sensing a threat, sharply pointed the fiery sword, and flames rose up around their fight. However, Bob managed to break through his defense and left a deep wound on his fiery body. This only angered the demon, and Bob, trying not to retreat, watched his movements with tension. Surtur, with a fierce rage in his eyes, activated his Fire Eyes skill. Bob decided to dodge the stream of fire, trying to use his agility and speed. A furious stream of flame erupted, seeking to incinerate Bob. Using all his strength and technique, Bob fought off the demon's stream of fire with his sword. The hero used another ice crystal and decided to finish quickly because his body would not be able to withstand the low temperature for a long time. The demon swung his sword again, his fiery energy sparkling around the blade. Dodging the blow, Bob slipped to the side and used the moment to quickly head towards the demon. Moving with incredible speed, he delivered a decisive blow to the demon's leg, and a dull sound was heard from his powerful blow. Surtur's eyes filled with rage and pain. The demon felt his powers begin to fade. The powerful blow caused the demon to fall to his knees with a deafening sound, like thunder rumbled in the night. Bob wasted no time in seizing the opportunity. He jumped quickly and found himself behind the demon, preparing for the decisive blow. Landing on the demon's back, Bob felt his body being subjected to intense heat emanating from the fiery entity beneath him. The demon seethed with rage and shouted that Bob was an impudent fellow who dared to attack him in such a way. The demon emitted such intense heat that it seemed like the air around him was melting. Bob's body was under intense strain from the unbearable heat that emanated from the demon, forcing every muscle and cell in him to fight the fire. Bob swung his sword, preparing to deliver the finishing blow. The protagonist activated the mana sword, and the blade of his weapon glowed with a bright magical light, enhanced by energy. The blade pierced Surtur's flesh as he thrust the sword into his body, causing the demon to howl in pain as the heat around him grew even more intense. After the blow, Bob's sword was barely hanging on the verge of breaking. Its blade was covered in cracks and emitting a dim light. Surtur fell to the ground with a dull thud, the fiery light that had emanated from him fading. Bob shouted victory, his voice echoing through the deserted street filled with the remains of the battle. The hero immediately remembered his comrades, and joy pierced his heart. Bob had a tired but satisfied smile on his face as he slowly rose to his feet and passed out. After a while, he woke up, remembering the recent battle. Next to him, on the battlefield covered with debris and ash, lay the body of a defeated demon. Burns were visible on the hero's hands. The burned skin was red and blistered in places. Images of a brutal battle, flashes of fire, thunderous sword blows. His own exhausted figure flashed through Bob's mind. With difficulty moving due to burns and fatigue, the hero headed towards the demon's body. His movements were slow. Bob began to pick through the demon's corpse, trying to find something valuable. Finally, Bob found a crystal, which turned out to be the heart of Surtur. This crystal emitted a mysterious light. The protagonist wanted to swallow the crystal immediately to gain its power, but realized that he did not have enough stamina points. Majestically and powerfully, as before, the manager suddenly appeared before the hero. Before Bob had time to put the crystal in his inventory, he continued to stand motionless in front of him as Bob jumped off the demon's body. "You bring a lot of problems and upset the balance. Your actions have led to a lot of violations of order," the manager said, clutching his head. "To begin with, I will send you to the next location. Your presence here has caused a lot of problems, and I will need to deal with the consequences," he continued. The steward extended his hand and Bob, hesitating only for a moment, extended his own. They shook hands, and the other stewards and I spent a lot of time deciding what award to give you, the steward added. Bob received a new skill, a significant increase in skill points and a stat boost. The hero immediately began to learn a new skill that was previously unknown to him. Bob asked the manager for a small pill to restore his stamina after the brutal battle. While the hero was swallowing the pill, the manager was about to leave. He felt his wounds begin to heal and the pain and fatigue gradually disappear. The manager said goodbye to Bob, advising him to hurry to the portal. After the manager's words, Bob passed out. His body, exhausted by battles and wounds, could not withstand it and fell into sleep. After a while, Bob began to teleport, his body gradually disappearing into the light. While Bob was being teleported, he thought about what was happening. His thoughts were focused on the latest events. Bob found himself in a new place. He slowly came to his senses and looked around, studying his surroundings. When the teleportation was complete, Bob found himself in a new place, surrounded by people he didn't know. These people looked like they had just arrived there. Their expressions combined curiosity and wariness. They looked at Bob with interest, but there was no sense of hostility between them. This place turned out to be a central area for participants from different locations. The voice was loud and clear. All the participants froze in anticipation, their attention focused on the voice. The voice continued, adding instructions that this island was in the process of being flooded and that everyone had a limited time to prove their eligibility to continue participating in the trials. A deafening roar came from the volcano, signaling the beginning of the test on the sinking island. People began to come to life, actively preparing for testing and research. Bob thought for a second, realizing that he now had a new goal. 3 people stood and discussed something, leisurely, amidst an anxious atmosphere. One of them suggested creating a team to survive together in the current situation. The character in the white cape declined the offer with a smile, citing his own plans and preferences. He said that he trusted virtually no one here and preferred to act alone. Bob noticed him. The character seemed familiar to him. One of the people rushed at the stranger with the white cape, trying to attack him. The stranger's eyes glowed yellow, emitting an aura of power. People around were struck by bright yellow lightning. Sparks flew in all directions. Some bodies were flying through the air, struck by lightning, generated by the strange powers of the stranger. People fell, losing their balance and flying in different directions like puppets on strings. When the stranger removed his hood, a striking appearance was revealed to those gathered. The others were amazed by the strength of the stranger, who, with a terrifying appearance and amazing power, showed with just one movement that he was capable of much. Bob was mentally assessing the stranger, evaluating him as a potential ally or enemy. The protagonist knew that the stranger was born in the tower, making him especially dangerous and potentially a powerful enemy or valuable ally. The stranger looked very much like one of the famous characters, Bob thought to himself. Bob continued to think, but I needed to go somewhere else. No time to deal with him. Suddenly, the stranger himself approached Bob, which he did not even understand how the stranger did it. But his dignity was felt even from a distance. The stranger introduced himself as Leo, and looking at Bob with interest asked, "Who are you?" Leo pointed at Bob's clothes and added with slight surprise, "Where did you get such unusual clothes?" The protagonist looked coldly at Leo, not giving in to his provocations. Bob, with the same expression on his face, replied that he bought it with points. Leo, without taking his eyes off Bob, asked him what level he was. Bob, keeping his cool, replied that it was impolite to ask such questions. The character thought for a moment, then said approvingly that Bob was a good man for having learned this important truth. Seeing in him the potential and strength needed to successfully complete the upcoming challenges, Leo invited Bob to join his team. Bob replied that he was not interested and, not wanting to linger, got ready to leave. Leo stood there in bewilderment as Bob walked away without accepting his offer. The hero rushed after Bob with lightning speed, not wanting to let him go without an explanation. But Leo was stopped by rats that suddenly jumped out of the shadows and surrounded him, blocking his path. He dealt with the rats and stopped. Behind Leo lay the corpses of rats that he had successfully destroyed with his lightning strike. His gaze was focused, but Bob was no longer visible. Bob slipped away from him, and Leo thought to himself that Bob really did have some unique skills. Leo thought about it, analyzing what was happening, and realized that Bob, despite his detachment, could be of great value as an ally. The character, with a smile on his face, came up with a plan to lure Bob out. Meanwhile, Bob realized that he had come loose and stopped. Bob was finally convinced that no one was following him and that he really was alone. The protagonist thought about the chase, wondering if Leo was actually interested in pursuing him or if it was just a way to distract him. After some thought, Bob approached the cave, trying to explore its surroundings as carefully as possible. Suddenly, a creature attacked Bob from the darkness of the cave, its sharp claws and teeth trying to tear the hero's skin. Bob instantly reacted to the attack. In a few quick movements, he pulled out his sword and delivered an accurate blow. The character dealt with several monsters inside the cave, leaving behind only pools of blood and destroyed bodies. In the cave, Bob sprayed a powder that masked his scent so that no one could smell him. Bob sat down on the cave floor and took Surtur's heart out of his inventory. Bob's body was recovering and he decided to swallow the crystal. Fire spread through the hero's veins, filling his body with unknown energy. Bob's entire body was burning madly, the flames spreading through his veins, filling him with burning power and unbearable pain. Bob fell down in pain, his body writhing on the ground, overcome with unbearable heat and torment. In his agony, Bob saw the silhouette of a character in a lion-skin cape emerge from the fire like a spirit. Bob screamed in pain as the fire from the crystal engulfed every cell of his being. As the fire died down, Bob's stats began to improve and the pain gradually eased, giving him hope for relief. Bob collapsed to the ground again, the last of his strength drained as his body continued to adapt to the new power. The hero lay on the ground, his body covered in sweat. But with each passing moment, his condition improved. The fiery streaks on his skin gradually subsided. The main character, having received a new skill, could not withstand the load and passed out, losing consciousness from fatigue and pain. 6 hours passed and Bob woke up, slowly opening his eyes, feeling that the pain and burning that had tormented him earlier had significantly diminished. A strange thought flashed through Bob's mind. What if his further journey was not only a test of strength? Having fully recovered, Bob opened the leaderboard and saw that he was falling behind. Bob walked out of the cave and the sun's rays illuminated his face. Bob now had fiery eyes that glowed with a bright fiery light. Ahead, Bob saw a village surrounded by greenery. Through the curtain of trees and bushes, he noticed low houses with thatched roofs. It was an orc village, different from the usual peaceful appearance. Round houses with thick walls, built of rough wooden logs and stone. Bob slowly approached the orc village, his steps confident and insistent. The hero decided to test his new giant fire skill on the orcs, feeling that it could be a great way to test the power of his recent upgrades. Every house and orc in the village was engulfed in flames, the flames glowing brightly and raging in the air, consuming everything that remained intact. With each orc he killed, Bob felt his level increase, his strength and abilities improving. Leo and his companion stood on a hill, discussing possible actions. Henry was a tall man with green eyes, brown hair, and a green robe. Leo announced that the team needed another member with unique skills to increase their chances of success. But first, they needed to hunt to improve their skills and gather resources for the upcoming challenges. Haley, a dark elf half-breed with white hair, created a blue sphere of energy in her hand. The heroes stood over the pit, looking into it, preparing for the upcoming test. Leo jumped into the pit, warning the others to stay away from the edges to avoid getting hit. The hero gathered his strength, concentrating the energy in his hand, and swung powerfully, preparing to strike. There was a loud thud, followed by a burst of yellow lightning that spread across the pit, illuminating everything around. Henry, amazed at the scale of the destruction, asked in surprise if this was really the place they had spoken of. Leo confirmed that this was the place and invited the others to enter. Haley asked Leo warily what awaited them in this place. Leo looked carefully at the entrance to the cave, as if expecting something. Henry called out to Leo, watching his expression warily. Leo, embittered that Bob had overtaken him in points, rushed forward in a rage, destroying the tracks in his path. The others, watching Leo's sudden and foolish act, watched in bewilderment as he went deeper into the cave. Thea, Haley's sister and a half-dark elf, noted that Leo had a competitive streak and added that his desire to outdo Bob made him unpredictable. Henry stood a little confused as a girl in light armor approached him. It was Meg, a mercenary who came from a magical background. The heroes caught up with Leo, and a fork opened up in front of them. The road divided into two paths. Leo decided to split the team to explore both paths and increase his chances. Meg pulled out her weapon and prepared to go down one of the paths. The character swung her sword and, with a determined attitude, moved forward along with the rest of the squad. Huge caterpillars covered with a hard shell appeared on the detachment's path. Meg's movements were precise and graceful, each swing of her sword seeming to carve a path through the thick shells of the caterpillars, demonstrating skill and confidence. The rest were already tired of clearing the cave, and fatigue began to affect their actions. Henry's mana levels were low, and he decided to conserve it so as not to deplete his resources before the end of the battle. A huge door appeared before the heroes, leading into the depths of the cave. Henry said that the boss is behind this door. Meg warned them not to relax and to prepare for the upcoming battle. Henry said with a smile that everything was fine. Meg asked what was the matter. Suddenly, a terrible sound was heard from behind the massive gates, which resembled a deep growl, drowning out all other sounds. The heroes gripped their weapons tightly, their fingers tense on the handles, ready for battle. Meg was the first to enter the gate with determination, her sword ready for action. The room the heroes entered was covered in blood, and the blood was spreading across the floor, forming foul-smelling puddles. The heroes looked questioningly, their eyes full of worry and tension. Henry noticed a shadow flashing in the corner of the room. He immediately became alert and gave a signal to the others. The shadow's eyes glowed with fire, their bright yellow light reminiscent of hot coals. As the shadow in front of them took shape, the heroes saw that it was Bob, his eyes blazing with a bright flame. Bob now looked like something completely different, gifted, and frightening. A vivid and tense scene flashed through Bob's mind. The hero noted to himself that the boss was incredibly tenacious. Every attack and every magic he used against the boss didn't seem as effective as expected. But despite the boss's incredible tenacity, Bob was victorious. The battle was difficult and exhausting. The fight with such a strong opponent showed what he was really capable of, and despite the fatigue, he felt satisfaction. Bob sat on the huge carcass of the monster, his breathing still heavy from the recent battle. He turned to the heroes who entered the hall and said ironically, "You are late." Thea, with surprise and disbelief in her voice, asked, "Did you deal with him alone?" Henry couldn't believe what he was seeing. "I didn't even know anyone could be stronger than Leo," he thought to himself. "As you can see, I managed it alone," Bob continued. Bob carefully assessed the heroes, noticing their surprise and confusion. The protagonist realized that they had split into two groups to hunt. Bob turned his attention to Meg, realizing that she was behind Leo on the leaderboard, which could mean she was high level. Henry approached Bob with an offer to join their team, noting that their group needed strong players like him. The protagonist refused Henry's offer, after which Meg asked if he was going to go to the boss alone again. When Meg asked if he was going to go to his boss alone again, Bob said yes. Meg reminded Bob that the whole point of beating a boss was to work as a team, not to fight alone. Bob didn't react to Meg's remark, continuing to stare intently. "So, what you want?" Bob began to say. Thea contacted Leo and informed him about the situation with Bob and that they were too late to defeat the boss. Leo appeared in the hall at the same second. The hero, shouting Bob's name, headed towards him with all his might. Leo almost approached Bob, but he did not flinch, remaining standing in place with a cold expression on his face. Bob simply grabbed Leo by the head and held him in place, not allowing him to move. With his next move, Bob pressed Leo against the monster's body, holding him in a tight grip. Leo's allies looked at this with surprise. Bob continued, letting go of Leo. "Do you want to survive or just pass the boss?" Meg thought for a second, realizing that Bob was questioning their priorities. At that very moment, Meg became furious, unable to bear Bob's disparaging tone. Bob didn't react, remaining unperturbed by Meg's outburst of anger. The main character, raising his finger up, said that his goal was not just to climb the tower, but to break through its ceiling. Leo finally broke free from Bob's grip and screamed, "What are you doing?" "I thought you were going to attack, so I defended myself," Bob replied. "When you have a strong man like that coming at you, that's all you can do," Bob continued. "If so, then forgive me," Leo replied. And Henry was embarrassed, noticing that this conviction had an effect on him. "Breaking through the ceiling is a very ambitious plan," Leo began to say. Bob replied, "A sardine cannot swim with a whale. Don't think of me as some sardine. I'll be king someday," Leo replied. Leo's allies watched their dialogue with interest and bewilderment. Bob smiled slightly as he watched the reactions of Leo and his allies. Leo offered Bob a bet that if his team and he killed the next boss first, Bob would agree to join their team. And if he and his team fail to defeat the boss first, he will come to Bob's aid when he calls. Bob agreed to Leo's proposal, and they agreed to meet at the next bosses to decide which of them could handle the task first. Bob jumped off the monster's carcass. "Then see you at the next boss," Leo said, banging his fists. Bob looked a little embarrassed and added, "Good luck to you." Leo jumped off the monster's carcass and called his allies. "We need to hurry," he said. "Time is of the essence." Turning around and heading towards the exit of the hall, Bob raised his hand up and noticed that time had stopped. Leo, slightly surprised, asked what that meant. The main character replied, "We are not on an island, but on a living creature. And these monsters were just parasites," Bob added. "So this boss was the king of parasites," Leo said, looking at the carcass. "And to get rid of the parasites, the creature had to dive underwater, and then the salt water would kill the parasites. But now that they were dead, the countdown stopped." Bob explained and turned around. The two characters on the surface looked on in surprise as the countdown suddenly stopped. They were fighting the orcs on the surface when the countdown suddenly stopped. The sword quickly plunged into the red orc's head, cutting off his battle cry. It was thrown by Bob's sword, hitting its target with precision. The other orcs looked at each other warily, sensing the growing threat. Bob, pulling the sword from the orc's corpse, was intently assessing his next target. His eyes glowed with a fiery light, preparing for the next clash. The orcs, seeing Bob's power and determination, began to flee in panic. The countdown has begun, and Bob realizes that time is limited and he needs to act quickly. Lightning flashed brightly, striking the mountain and illuminating its surroundings. At the top of the mountain, the heroes gathered, ready to face a new challenge. Thea and Henry watched as the heroes gathered at the top of the mountain, their eyes following every move. Some of the heroes already looked significantly stronger. Their armor and weapons were more impressive. Meg walked up to Henry and Thea. She looked around carefully and said that not everyone would survive. They stood on a hill and watched what was happening below. Leo walked up to them, his face focused and his eyes sparkling with determination. He said that it looked like everyone was getting ready for the final stage. Henry noticed Bob among the crowd and turned towards him. Bob walked confidently towards the heroes, his cloak fluttering in the wind, and every step he took exuded confidence and determination. The protagonist activated his skill. He carefully studied the potential allies, assessing their strength and abilities. He noticed that the flow of mana in Henry and Thea had changed. They had become stronger. Leo greeted Bob with a slight smile and noticeable interest, his voice laced with respect and hidden rivalry. The character asked, "Are you still going to go to the boss alone?" To which Bob replied that yes, he prefers to act alone, as he has his own goals and methods that suit him better. The man in black offered to team up with Bob, believing that his skills and strength would be a great addition to his team. Leo was instantly enraged when he saw a black-clad character asking Bob to join his team. The hero snapped his fingers and lightning appeared out of nowhere. Frightened, people began to run away and panic in different directions, and soon there was chaos all around, with screams and running. Saying that time was of the essence, Bob headed towards the crater. "Very interesting," Leo said with a smile, watching Bob approach the crater. Bob jumped into the crater, consumed by the desire to quickly deal with the boss. The protagonist landed, and a notification appeared that you had entered the boss room. The spirit of the upcoming battle was in the air. A horde of orcs appeared before Bob, led by a huge serpent that slithered and hissed, demonstrating its terrifying power. Following Bob, the rest of the heroes jumped into the crater. The two characters standing nearby were surprised by the number of orcs that surrounded them. Bob quickly glanced around the room. Hordes of orcs and a huge snake ready to attack. Having identified the possible weak points of the opponents and his own strengths, the hero prepared for battle. Bob took out his sword and used the fire whirlwind skill on it, causing the sword to burst into a bright flame. The rest of the heroes watched with interest as Bob prepared for battle. They stood waiting to see what the hero was capable of. Leo, arms crossed, watched the proceedings, assessing his abilities in combat. Henry, noticing Bob's disappearance, became wary and began to carefully examine the surrounding area. Bob attacked the orcs from above, using the element of surprise to inflict maximum damage. Henry and Thea were amazed by Bob's skill and his ability to perform sudden and powerful attacks. The protagonist thrust his sword into the large red orc, dealing a crushing blow. Bob's eyes were ablaze with fire, adding to his fury and determination. Leo began to get angry as he watched Bob quickly gain victory. In an effort to prove his strength and show that he was no less capable in fighting, Leo decided to join Bob. Leo, with fury in his eyes, deftly broke the spears flying at him. Orc blood flew in all directions, mixing with the fiery flashes and light from the battle. Bob created a fiery whirlwind with his sword, which quickly tore the orcs and their armor to pieces. Leo's allies also decided to join the battle to support his Bob and destroy the remaining enemy forces. Meg and Henry ran, fighting orcs along the way and trying to provide support. Thea and Haley used their magic, creating powerful spells to weaken the orcs and make the fight easier. Henry used the mana concentration in his hand to deal devastating blows to the orcs. Bob noticed their coordinated work and appreciated how the magic and energy of the allies effectively destroyed the opponents. Their skills will definitely come in handy in what is about to begin, the hero thought to himself. Leo froze, as if he felt a great power. Before Leo appeared a majestic gate, shrouded in a mysterious aura, its surface covered with patterns like ancient symbols. Leo and Bob peered at the gate, their hands running over the intricate designs. When Bob began to slowly open the gate, Leo, seeing this, shouted, "Are you going there alone too?" Bob, ignoring Leo's cries, resolutely stepped through the opened gate. Horrible screams, piercing and unnatural, were heard from behind the gates, causing the other heroes to freeze in horror, and fear enveloped them. Leo clenched his fist, focusing all his inner strength into it, and his hand became unnaturally bright. When they entered, they were met by a giant chimera with flaming eyes and claws. One glance from the chimera made the blood in their veins run cold, and the heroes felt a cold fear run through their bodies. But the chimera was chained to a huge magical cage. Its giant paws were locked in chains. Bob, ignoring the horror, slowly approached the cage. Leo, without taking his eyes off the locked chimera, asked if this was the last boss. Away from Bob and Leo, at the foot of an ancient pedestal, the chimera control stone sparkled mysteriously. At that moment, a notification popped up in front of them, which said that the owner of the chimera received additional points for killing heroes. Meg thought, her eyes clouded with worry. Bob walked towards the rock when Leo grabbed his shoulder, his voice full of worry. "Wait, we need to think first." With the words, "Let go," Bob snatched the sword, his determination unwavering. Bob, with a powerful blow, destroyed the stone, and its ruins scattered throughout the room. Now that the stone was destroyed, Bob was in command of the chimera. Bob gave the order to the chimera to destroy the wall. Henry was surprised to see the wall being destroyed and Bob commanding the chimera. Bob, with a piercing gaze, turned to the group and said, "Our enemy is different." Leo, not hiding his anxious anticipation, asked who our real enemy was. The main character, with a heavy sigh, replied, "This is the creator of the chimera. Whether to come with me or not, it is your choice." Bob headed resolutely inside the ruined wall. Henry, looking anxiously at Leo, asked what we were going to do. Looking forward with determination, Leo replied, "Let's follow him first." The heroes followed Chimera and Bob into the destroyed passage. The room they entered resembled a sinister torture chamber. Its walls were covered with dark marks and terrifying mechanisms. At the end of the room stood a mysterious silhouette in a cloak. His figure was shrouded in darkness. Beneath the cloak was a disfigured figure, his body covered in scars and distortions that told a story of long suffering and madness. The chimera, sensing his presence, growled. The character tried to stitch together body parts scattered across the table. "Do not kill the chimera, but come to me with it," said the creator of the chimera, turning to the heroes. With a grim smile, he added, "It's funny. It seems you came in the middle of my work." The character looked at Bob and Leo appraisingly, his eyes gleaming with sinister interest. Leo's face turned red with anger, and he felt his patience running out. Leo, with anger in his voice, threw at the character, "You can try to control us, but remember one thing. We will not become part of your terrible games." Bob, noticing Leo's outburst of anger, calmly said, "Don't get excited, Leo. We need to stay cool." The character watched them with sinister interest. The main character, pointing to his eyes, asked, "Do you recognize who they are?" Bob showed his eyes more clearly, trying to attract attention. The character, seeing Bob's eyes, exploded with rage, and the room filled with the sounds of battle. The protagonist repelled the character's attack using a fiery vortex, his hand blazing brightly as he created a powerful fire field. The heroes quickly prepared for battle and took up positions. The character, looking at Bob with blazing anger, shouted, "You are related to that monkey!" Strange monsters began to emerge from the dark corners of the room. Their bodies deformed and twisted into horrific shapes. Bob, using the chimera, broke through the monsters that tried to surround him. While Leo was fighting the monsters, his allies arrived. Leo shouted with full determination, "Let's sweep them away!" His voice full of fighting spirit and energy. The battle began. The sounds of metal and magic rang out. Every blow, spell, and maneuver was aimed at breaking through the enemy lines and supporting Bob. Each of them, despite fatigue and danger, continued to fight with incredible determination. Bob, with determination, quickly approached the character. The creator of the chimera, seeing Bob approaching, suddenly raised his hands, and a massive protective coffin appeared from the shadows. The character suddenly had a staff in his hands that emitted an ominous light. Bob, gathering all his strength, smashed the coffin with a powerful blow. The hero's arm slightly increased in size and his muscles visibly strengthened. This was a new skill he had acquired, enhanced by his internal energy. The creator could not believe his eyes. When he saw it, he was shocked. Bob looked imposing. His arm radiated power and his eyes glowed with a fiery light. After seeing Bob demonstrate his powers, he suddenly realized that the hero was somehow connected to Olympus. Bob clenched his fist, his muscles tensing. The creator of the chimera screamed loudly in despair and rage. He swung his staff. The magical runes on its surface sparkled. Bob, ignoring the character's furious waving of his staff, resolutely walked towards him. The character once again summoned a reinforced coffin, which appeared in the air, surrounded by powerful protective magic. The protagonist, without slowing down, once again delivered a powerful blow to the reinforced coffin. The creator, in desperation, summoned a poisonous cloud that quickly filled the room, green smoke swirling ominously. Bob briefly recalled the words of his friend who had once warned him about the importance of protection. The fist moved towards the enemy with a powerful roar. The blow was so strong that it shook the air. After a powerful blow, the hand began to emit a green glow, filling with magical energy. The creator was thrown back with incredible force. Bob's eyes, breaking through the shadows, emitted a red light. The creator of the chimera, gathering the last remnants of his magical energy, summoned a black wall of thorns. The character thought to himself with grim satisfaction, "This is my strongest skill." He felt the magical energy concentrating in the black thorns and knew that he was now using all his power. But Bob was unstoppable. Despite the spikes and deadly traps, he continued to approach the character. With the magical light emanating from the staff, he hoped to stop the hero's relentless onslaught. The creator, feeling his last defenses beginning to crack, tensed to the limit, his face distorted with tension. The creator's defenses cracked under the pressure of Bob's onslaught. Bob, having overcome the last obstacles and approached the creator, grabbed him by the throat with incredible force. The protagonist pinned the character to the floor, squeezing his throat with relentless force. The creator was horrified, his eyes widened in fear. The main character hit him hard in the face. The hero, feeling that victory was near, began to furiously beat the character. His eyes burned with fire, reflecting fury and determination, searching for the creator's vulnerability. In the midst of a furious attack, Bob suddenly remembered the monkey's words. "Use the power of your eyes in moments of anger. With them you can see everything," he told Bob. "Concentrate on finding weak spots and attack with precision," he continued. Bob continued to hit harder to inflict maximum damage and wear down his opponent's strength. The creator, breathing heavily through groans and pain, said with difficulty, "I still will not die." Bob's eyes were shining with a bright light that became even more intense with anger. The protagonist, focusing his gaze on the character, noticed vulnerabilities in his body. The hero quickly and decisively grabbed the creator's hand and pulled it out. The creator, sensing that his defeat was inevitable, began to beg Bob to stop. But Bob's determination and fury were so powerful that they left no room for compassion or doubt. Bob grabbed the creator's leg, pressing with incredible force. Bob's friend's words flashed through his mind again, giving him additional strength. Bob's thoughts were filled with the joy of victory. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction that he had finally achieved his goal and defeated the enemy. Bob stood before the creator's body. The character was defeated, his body lying motionless on the floor. The monsters summoned by the creator fell to the floor, their bodies immobilized. The other heroes, watching as the monsters summoned by the creator fell and lost their power, were surprised. "Relax, they won't be a threat anymore," Bob said. Thea, looking around and noticing the tension on the faces of her allies, asked if anyone was hurt. Noticing that Meg looked particularly bad, Thea rushed to her side to help. "That's all," Leo asked, turning to Bob with a tired tone. "Let's move away," Leo suggested, taking a step back. Leo looked at Bob intently, his gaze focused and penetrating. "Because of your choice, someone got hurt," Leo began, his voice serious. Leo asked if it was necessary to kill the creator. Bob, meeting Leo's gaze, answered with confidence, "Yes, it was necessary." Leo continued with a slight anger on his face. "You could have broken the record without letting anyone down?" The protagonist thought for a moment and remembered a battle from the past. He remembered how his choice that time also required sacrifices and difficult decisions. Bob, deeply aware of his answer, said with a heavy sigh, "There was no other way to do it." Leo, after hearing Bob's explanation, still couldn't understand what he was talking about. Leo was about to leave, lost in thought, when suddenly the manager appeared. The character turned around and saw some beggar next to Bob. Bob, noticing the appearance of the Master of Ceremonies, said, "The Master of Ceremonies is here." Leo, immediately realizing the significance of the moment, bowed with respect. The manager, looking at Leo with genuine anger, said, "You started from Olympus. I am ready to rip out Zeus's beard right now." The manager grabbed his head, expressing despair and shock. "Because of you, Bob, I'll have a lot of work again," he continued. The character, with a deep sigh, tried to change his tone and added, "But I am here to reward you," and handed Bob a blue crystal sparkling in his hand. The crystal emitted a dark and mysterious light. Bob, taking the black godstone, thought to himself, "2 more are needed. Collecting the rest of the stones will be easier than I expected," the hero thought to himself in surprise. "All rewards have been received. Now I am sending you to the tower." The manager made a gesture with his hand, and the space in front of the heroes began to shimmer. The manager added, with a clear hint of severity, "Do not create disorder there." The character remained in place, watching their movements with an expression of grave satisfaction and anticipation. In an instant, the heroes found themselves in the vicinity of the tower. The 2 strangers, noticing the appearance of the heroes, immediately turned their attention to them. Bob thought to himself, "Everyone here is a player now." Leo, looking around the area, noticed several figures. These people wore clothes and symbols typical of Olympians. He asked Bob, "Are you going to join the guild?" Bob replied, "No, I'm not going to join the guild." Then he added, "By the way, about meeting with the manager." Leo asked with interest, "What do you want to say?" His voice was full of curiosity and anticipation. The protagonist continued with a serious expression on his face. "You need to find out the whole background of Olympus yourself. That's all," said Bob. And having finished the conversation, he was about to leave. Bob, waving goodbye, added, "Be careful with the Jackals." One of the Olympians approached Leo and bowed, his presence immediately attracting attention. The Olympian who approached Leo turned out to be Greg, Ares' chief of guard. Leo asked what you wanted. Greg replied with a cold and commanding tone, "I wanted to know how prepared you were for the challenge." His words, full of contempt and arrogance, angered Leo. Leo, enraged, felt anger boiling in his chest as he tensed and prepared to strike. Greg, noticing Leo's intention and reading his anger on his face, said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. My words were misunderstood." Leo, still not hiding his displeasure, snapped, "Go." Before leaving, Greg asked who it was with you, to which Leo replied that it was a friend. Ahead, beyond the horizon, the city loomed, its silhouette clearly outlined against the sky. Jackals are robbing new players who haven't joined the guild, Bob thought to himself. He knew that if the Jackals were a real threat, then action had to be taken. The hero, continuing to think, suddenly felt that he was being watched. His instincts became alert. "Great, I'll test something on them," Bob continued to think. The observers wore wolf masks that hid their faces. These people were clearly planning an attack and were already preparing for action. Suddenly, as if he had dissolved into thin air, Bob disappeared, and the observers froze in place, surprised and confused. The severed heads fell to the ground at different speeds. The Jackals realized that they were facing something much more dangerous than they expected. One by one, Bob methodically and mercilessly eliminated the Jackals. Bob grabbed one of the Jackals, his hands squeezing his opponent tightly. The main character removed the mask from one of the Jackals, and underneath it was a frightened red-haired man. "I have a question," the hero said in a firm and decisive tone. Bob swung his arm, preparing to strike. The protagonist hit. Under the pressure of pain and threats, the character, overcome with fear, shouted, Okay, I will answer all the questions." Bob, keeping the tension in his voice, asked where to find Cloudless. The city at night was truly magnificent, the reflection of the lights dancing on the water of the canals, creating mesmerizing patterns. The main character was sitting in a cozy restaurant located on one of the crowded streets. Bob stretched his neck, feeling the tension and fatigue from the previous events gradually recede. The nearby bazaar was bustling with people, and street vendors were attracting customers with their brightly colored wares. The hero remembered how he used to spend time here with his comrades. These memories were full of warmth and nostalgia. Bob snapped back to reality, realizing it was no time to be nostalgic, and he took out the stone the manager had given him. The main character knew who to go to with this stone. Bob knew a blacksmith who could help him work the stone. The hero went outside, where the air was fresh. There was a man standing in front with a boy. He was holding the boy as if protecting him. Without stopping, Bob walked past the man and the boy. Suddenly, the hero felt a knife pressing into his back. Bob deftly threw down the stranger who was trying to attack. Other gang members ran up, ready to support their comrade. Bob quickly dealt with the rest of the gang members using his skills and strength. He told them not to rob anymore and left, leaving behind tired and battered bandits. On the house hung a blacksmith sign. decorated with an image of a hammer and shield. It swayed in the wind, creating a light metallic sound. Bob stepped inside and the warmth of the forge enveloped him. The blacksmith was muscular, with gray hair that was striking. Despite his age, he looked strong and full of vitality. He asked Bob, "Are you lost?" Bob, looking at the sword, replied that he had come specifically for it. The hero took the sword, examined it, and said that it was of poor quality. At this, the blacksmith frowned, his face becoming tense with displeasure. The blacksmith took the hammer and his eyes lit up with fire. He asked Bob where he came from. Bob took out a sphere with the number 1 on it. The main character took out the crystal. The blacksmith, seeing this, looked closely and became interested. The blacksmith peered into the crystal with deep interest. His eyes filled with curiosity as he followed the play of light. Bob asked if the blacksmith could work the crystal. "Even after you saw the lousy goods of this forge, you are ready to entrust it to me?" the blacksmith asked with surprise. The protagonist answered, "Yes," to which the blacksmith, with displeasure and disgust, said, "Crazy," and turned around. Bob picked up the sword again and looked at it carefully, checking every detail carefully. He said that the sword may be bad, but the blacksmith's handwriting can still be seen. The character looked at the hero with unexpected interest. "What are you doing?" he asked, looking at Bob with obvious surprise. The blacksmith, after a pause, finally agreed to take on the order, his face gradually filling with determination. Patrick, that was the name of the blacksmith, put forward the condition that no one should know about the order. Bob agreed, promising to keep the secret. Bob sat and dined in the tavern, enjoying the comfort and taste of the food. Leo sat down next to him, smiling. "I've been looking for you for a long time," he said, sitting down at the table and pouring himself a drink. "Give me your number already," Leo demanded comically. "I didn't think a man would shoot my number," Bob replied. A waiter approached them, holding a tray in his hands. "Bob," he turned to Leo, "can you help me with something?" Leo, chewing, asked what. "Kill the leader of the Jackals," Bob replied. Leo choked and stuck his fork in his mouth to clear his throat. "Okay, tomorrow night," Leo said, then stood up and walked away, leaving Bob alone at the table. Bob noticed that someone was watching him, feeling a keen gaze that would not leave him alone. The stranger approached, removed his hood, and introduced himself as Gregor. He sat down at Bob's table without being invited and settled down opposite him, looking at him intently. "You came in first, Leo came in second. Rumor has it you're a monster," he began. "I'll take that as a compliment," Bob replied, not losing his confidence. Gregor took a sip of tea, his face expressionless. "Come to my Lord Ares," he continued, pausing to give Bob time to think. Bob said that was enough and drank his tea, ignoring the offer. "So you refuse Olympus's offer," Gregor said after Bob. Bob replied that he would not work with unworthy people. Gregor sat angry, his face gloomy and tense. He thought about it and began to formulate a plan, carefully planning how to use the Jackals to accomplish his goal. A servant approached him, approaching cautiously. "We'll kill Bob with the Jackals," Gregor said, his voice full of cold calculation. "Prepare 100 men," he said to his servants, confidently and decisively. "Follow me first," Bob said to Leo, leading him along. Leo looked at Bob silently, his gaze full of expectation. The creator's words flashed through Leo's mind. Bob walked forward down the street, leading the way confidently. Leo was deep in thought, lost in his own thoughts, while Bob moved forward confidently. Bob called out to him, "Hey Leo, everything's okay," with a slight note of concern in his voice. They entered a store where there was only one person who was watching them carefully as they entered. Bob asked, "Are you Cloudless?" And the man, noticing the alarm, immediately tried to run away. The main character instantly caught up with him, grabbed him by the shoulder and stopped the fugitive. The stranger tried to pull out the knife. Bob, not allowing him to attack, disarmed him with a deft throw. He pinned him to the floor and said, "Sit down," with a hard determination in his voice. Bob, holding the stranger on the floor, said, "I need the king of the Jackals." He tied up Cloudless, carefully wrapping the ropes and ensuring that he couldn't escape. "He looks frail." "It's unlikely to be him," Leo said, looking at the tied-up man doubtfully. "Look at this knife," Bob said, showing Leo the weapon he had taken from Cloudless. "There's a high level of poison on him." "It's definitely him," Bob continued. The man was sitting tied up. Cloudless's face and voice changed, and he said how the information had leaked. There," said Bob Leo, confirming that this man was the Cloudless one. "Do you at least know who is behind me?" Cloudless said threateningly. Leo remembered Bob's words before they entered, the warning that they might encounter someone dangerous. Lightning filled the room. Bright light and crackling filled the space. Bob asked, "Do you take orders from Gregor?" Cloudless's face twisted and he answered, "Yes. "We have a favor to ask of you," said Leo. Bob continued, "Gather all the jackals and come to the specified place by midnight, and then Olympus will reward you." The main character asked, "Can you handle it?" His voice was full of confidence. Bob thrust the note at Cloudless without letting go. "Come on," Bob said to Leo, pulling him toward the exit. "Maybe you should explain everything," Leo began when they went outside. "You want me to believe that the jackals and Olympus are cooperating," Leo continued. "Believe it or not, it's your business," Bob replied. "But you heard it all yourself." The next day, Bob was waiting for Leo at the city gates. "If you had stayed a little longer, I would have gone alone," Bob said when Leo finally approached. "I have thought about your words. Even though Olympus was my home, I must know everything," Leo said, deciding to go with Bob. A vision of his mother flashed through Leo's mind, her image full of love and wisdom, reminding him of the importance of the decision he had made. After talking a little more, they decided to set off. "There should be no jackals," Leo said, assuming his fighting form. Meanwhile, not far from the city, the jackals gathered in a cave preparing for their plan and discussing the details of the upcoming conspiracy. The chief of the jackals asked if everything was in place. His voice was stern and demanding. One of the jackals coughed, attracting the attention of the leader. Everyone gathered and raised their heads, listening attentively to the chief, Cloudless, who stood before them. He raised his sword and, greeting everyone, said, "Today we will change the course of events." Everyone raised their hands in the air, rejoicing and welcoming the upcoming changes. Two more masked men appeared. "These are our patrons from Olympus," said the chief. He bowed to them and greeted them. The chief handed them a wad of Asgardian money, saying, "This is payment for your help. Let it be the beginning of a great alliance between us." One of the strangers took the money and remained silent, his face remaining hidden under a mask. "Excellent," said the stranger, putting the money into the inventory. "All that remains is to say goodbye." Snapping his fingers, said the stranger, and everything around burst into flames. A blinding light filled the cave, leaving only shadows and smoke. The jackals began to burn and scream, their terrible cries mixing with the crackling fire and howling flames as they tried to escape the deadly firestorm. Leo emerged from beneath the mask first, his eyes burning with determination as he tore through the fabric and stepped into the fiery chaos. Bob then revealed his identity by removing his mask and drawing his sword. Leo spared no one who tried to escape. Every blow prevented any escape for the jackals. The chief jackal, in a panic, tried to contact someone through his ball, but his efforts were interrupted by Bob, who destroyed the amulet with his sword, leaving no chance for help. The character, surrounded by tongues of flame, looked at the heroes with an expression of extreme horror and despair. He removed his mask, revealing his distorted face, and, full of rage and despair, rushed into battle with Bob. Cloudless screamed in pain as Bob struck again, breaking through his defense. The protagonist dealt the final blow to Bezableni. After the heroes completed the cleanup and were sure that the threat was eliminated, they exited the cave and found themselves in the fresh air. Leo looked at Bob and sighed. Leo was silent, looking at Bob, and internally he realized that he was not used to the cruelty of war and killing. "How can you be so unperturbed?" Leo asked. Bob looked at Leo and replied, "Sometimes, in order to survive, you have to accept reality as it is and not let emotions get in the way of action." "You didn't seem kind before," Leo said. Bob shrugged and replied that being cruel was sometimes a necessity, not a choice. The main character took out a wad of money and said that they had not just started this business for nothing and suggested that Leo split the money. Leo was surprised and asked, "Seriously, do you really feel that way about this money?" "You can refuse," Bob began. But Leo interrupted him. "Okay, let's split it." "You still haven't told me what the manager gave you as a reward," Bob said. Nervously pounding his fist on the table, Gregor exclaimed why he couldn't contact Cloudless. At the same time, a man ran into the tavern and, out of breath, said, "I found the jackals, they are all dead." After some time, they stood in a cave in front of a mountain of corpses, indicating the complete elimination of the jackals. Gregor became enraged as he looked at the pile of corpses and began to scream. Bob was about to go to bed. The hero, examining the contents of his inventory, decided to examine the egg he received as a reward. Bob picked up the egg and examined it. It was an unusual color and had mysterious symbols on it that he couldn't decipher. If Leo had the hand of thunder, then the egg might be equal in value and potential power, Bob thought. Suddenly, for a second, the space around Bob changed. The egg greeted him. Bob recognized the patterns on the egg as symbolism of the outer gods, and realized that it was connected to ancient and powerful forces. "What the hell are you?" Bob thought. The main character approached the door of the forge. Patrick was working on something, forging metal with concentration, when Bob entered the forge. "I have processed your stone," he began. "What kind of armor do you prefer?" he continued, pointing to the strange bottle. "It just turned out to be a byproduct, and it can be used to make armor," Patrick added. "I don't have any materials," Bob said. Patrick stood up abruptly and said that he had enough mithril. The blacksmith showed a blank made of mithril, shiny and strong. Patrick said that the cost would be high, since the mithril and work required a lot of effort, but emphasized that the quality of the product would justify the price. Bob thought about it. The hero offered Bob to take the product on credit, promising flexible payment terms. Bob agreed to the offer and took out his sword for Patrick to appreciate. "Okay," said Patrick. Then the blade. A week passed. Gregor stood and thought about how to get his lost money back. A soldier approached him and informed him that all the players and support had gathered. "Then go ahead," said Gregor. Meanwhile, Bob continued to kill monsters to increase his level. But the level was rising very slowly, and Bob felt that it would take much more effort to achieve the progress he wanted. At the same time, in the forge, Patrick was examining the stone. He studied each of its patterns and features. Suddenly there was a noise and Patrick became alert, listening to the sounds that came from behind the door of the forge. Taking his hammer, the hero headed towards the door, cautiously preparing for a possible threat. When Patrick went outside, he saw a detachment of soldiers led by Gregor. "I didn't expect to see you in such a hole, that's why they couldn't find you," Gregor began. "We have come for you," Hephaestus continued, pointing his sword. Hephaestus struck a powerful blow with his hammer, and the sound echoed throughout the area. The soldiers, seeing the power of the blow and the fury of Hephaestus, recoiled in fear, trying to keep their distance. A mysterious player appeared with fiery hair and clothes that sparkled in red and white hues. He pulled out a glittering spear, and Hephaestus stood in a fighting stance, ready to fight. Hephaestus rushed forward decisively, delivering the first crushing blow. Ricky, that was the character's name, instantly blocked the crushing blow. He deftly grabbed Hephaestus's hammer, seizing the initiative in the battle. Hephaestus threw the hero away with force. Hephaestus's eyes flashed with rage. He delivered a powerful blow, capable of breaking everything in its path. Hephaestus slightly injured Ricky, leaving a painful mark on his body. Ricky prepared to counterattack, intending to turn the pain into strength. Sparks and lightning flew through the air as Ricky quickly approached Hephaestus. A loud roar was heard throughout the city. Hephaestus, struck by the blow, began to turn to stone. Ricky used the Medusa shield created by Hephaestus against the hero. Hephaestus, completely petrified, collapsed to the ground. "Load the criminal quickly," Gregor ordered the soldiers. With words it won't do, Bob suddenly appeared. "Lousy people in this wonderful place," he continued. Ricky looked at Bob with curiosity and interest, his eyes clearly assessing the strength and determination of his opponent. Gregor stared at Bob tensely, his voice full of anger and surprise. Bob looked confidently at Gregor and said, "I'm his client." The protagonist used a fire whirlwind and turned the soldiers into living flames dancing in the chaos. Bob activated his flaming eyes and began searching for a trajectory to attack. With powerful jerks, Bob threw the soldiers around like puppets. He looked around like a hunter carefully examining a field. And without wasting any time, he released spheres of mana that flared into bright streams, tearing apart the space in front of him. There was a deafening explosion. "You think you can handle it with just numbers," the hero said confidently. The soldiers rushed towards him like a wave, unaware of the terrible power they were about to encounter. The hero activated a giant fire, and his eyes sparkled with rage, reflecting a power that could consume everything around him. Bob looked around to see if Hephaestus had awakened. Ricky broke through the blazing fire and stabbed Bob. Bob gathered his strength as he wiped his face. Ricky, slowly brushing away the fire, asked why Bob needed Hephaestus. Bob, taking the sword out of his inventory, replied that he needed Hephaestus to create a unique item. The protagonist activated the giant's skill, and his hand was filled with power, as if the power of the entire world was concentrated in it. Like a flash of lightning, Ricky threw his fire spear at Bob. Bob swung his arm and blocked Ricky's fiery spear, his hand meeting the flying spear with incredible force. The hero, focusing his energy, created spheres of mana that flared up around him. They began to slowly rotate. With a scream, Bob released mana spheres at Ricky. Ricky stood, his hand shaking, holding tightly to his shoulder, from which blood was streaming, drops of which fell to the ground. Bob activated the power of the giants again, and his hand was wrapped around by a powerful aura. But before Bob could fully compose himself, Ricky, with force and speed, dealt him a powerful blow, his fist cutting through the air and crashing into Bob. Bob coughed up blood, and red drops came out of his mouth. Ricky put all his strength into that punch. The hero was thrown back by a powerful blow and, like a projectile, flew through the air, breaking through the wall of the forge with a deafening roar. I had greatly underestimated him, Bob thought to himself, feeling the pain run through his body. He's going to be tough to handle, Bob muttered, looking around the ruined walls of the forge and clenching his jaw. Good job, Gregor said, approaching Ricky. A strange sound came from the hole in the wall, like the mysterious whisper of ancient shadows. Suddenly, a blue light burst out of the hole, tearing through the darkness like a flash of mysterious energy. Bob came out of the forge, and in his hand sparkled the stone that Hephaestus had been working on. The stone shimmered with a mysterious light, as if it contained a mysterious power. "Don't interfere," Ricky said, his voice stern and commanding. Bob stood, his eyes glowing with fiery light. In one hand he held a dark stone, shrouded in a mysterious glow, in the other, a sword. "Where are you going?" Bob asked, launching manospheres at the soldiers. Bob grabbed the petrified Hephaestus. "Kill him," Gregor ordered the soldiers, and at his command the soldiers, like an uncontrollable avalanche, rushed towards Bob. Bob used the dark stone and a vortex of dark energy erupted around him. The soldiers were destroyed, their bodies collapsed, and their eyes, filled with the light of dark energy, flickered with an unnatural light. Ricky, gathering all his will, decided to kill Bob at any cost. Bob fought the soldiers, each blow of his sword scattering the enemies. Ricky prepared to attack, his body tensed like a spring ready to spring forward. His eyes focused on Bob. Bob was ready to defend himself, his body in a stance, his sword and dark stone at the ready. Ricky spread his arms wide, his gesture like the spreading of huge wings, and magical energy began to flow from his roar. Bob squeezed the stone in his hand, his fingers wrapping around it like a powerful vice. They clashed, and a massive explosion ripped through the center of the collision, sending a huge wave of energy and sparks shooting out from the epicenter, throwing Bob and Ricky back. Bob was unconscious, his body lying lifeless among the rubble. Gregor, noticing this, decided to take advantage of the moment. But Hephaestus intervened, and the curse was finally lifted from the petrified body. "Get away, you brat," Hephaestus said angrily, his voice like thunder. "I'll finish you off," Hephaestus shouted. Gregor got scared. Hephaestus swung his hammer, his muscles tensing like steel springs. But the floor manager intervened and stopped Hephaestus's hammer. The steward threw Hephaestus's hand aside, as if deflecting a blowing stream of wind. The manager looked at the Olympians with a menacing gaze. Gregor was shaking with fear. His body was shaking, his face was pale, and his eyes were full of horror. The manager flicked the helmet off Gregor's head, sending it flying to the side like a projectile. The character touched Gregor's forehead with his finger, a gesture that was a reminder of greatness and power. And Gregor, feeling the touch, understood that every word he had to convey to Zeus would be carefully checked and weighed. Hephaestus smiled, and his smile was full of shadow and irony, like the night glow. The final fight scene was the last thing Bob remembered. Bob began to come to his senses, lying on the bed, his body surrounded by soft light shining through the curtains. Hephaestus hovered above him, his face seeming to float in the air. "Are you okay?" Hephaestus asked, his voice deep and concerned. "How did it all end?" Bob asked, his voice worried. "Everything is fine," Hephaestus replied, his voice calm and confident. "Thank you, but go to the hospital," he continued. Hephaestus took the pickaxe and his hands gripped the handle tightly. He said that his name was not Patrick, but Hephaestus. Bob wasn't surprised. He knew who he was. "In gratitude, I'll make you a better blade," Hephaestus continued. Bob was delighted. His face lit up with a slight smile. The main character got out of bed and, with a slight smile on his lips, said, "I'll wait." Time passed. Bob fought with gorillas. The stone is strong, Bob thought to himself, feeling his hand fill with power and heaviness. But it was difficult to control it constantly. The stone, despite its strength, exerted continuous pressure and resistance, requiring more and more concentration and effort from Bob. "I need to get stronger," he thought, realizing that his current efforts and control over the stone required much greater skill and power. Bob entered the forge. "Judging by the silence you finished," the hero began. "Yes, everything is ready," Hephaestus answered, his voice confident and satisfied. He handed Bob the box. Bob shook the box, trying to figure out what was in it. The sound of the contents was soft and mysterious. "We agreed on a blade," Bob said. "Is this a surprise box?" Bob asked when Hephaestus insisted that he open it. Bob opened the box and found a glove inside. He tried it on carefully. Its material hugged his arm perfectly. There was a slot in the glove that could accommodate the stone, Hephaestus said, and Bob was delighted, his eyes sparkling. "Here is a blade for you," Hephaestus continued, handing Bob an elegant sword. The hero took it. The handle was decorated with intricate engravings, and the blade sparkled like frozen light. Bob called it the Dark Knight Sword. Hephaestus has such a bad taste in names, he thought to himself. The protagonist was pleased, his face glowing with satisfaction as he hung the sword on his belt. "Are you planning to go up further?" Hephaestus asked curiously. "Yes, I want to overthrow Olympus," Bob answered. Hephaestus raised his eyebrows in surprise and said, "Really? Okay, go. I won't see you off," Hephaestus said after Bob, and the hero went out into the street. "A dry farewell, then. And now," Bob thought to himself. Fragments of the past flashed through Bob's mind. Bob bowed to the forge door as a sign of respect and farewell. The Coliseum's test supervisor, Shuri, sat at the table. Shuri took a bite of the chocolate, each piece melting on her tongue. Shuri studied Bob's file, her gaze sliding like that of a scientist working on an important discovery. Came alone to the test, Shuri thought to herself, her gaze lingering on Bob. "Well, let him try as much as he wants," she said to herself. Bob was in the center of the Coliseum arena, his figure clearly visible in the huge circle surrounded by high walls. "This test is simple. You just need to defeat the opponent," Bob thought to himself, looking around the arena. "My previous entry was ranked 12th, Bob noted to himself as he looked at the leaderboard. Bob drew his sword, its blade gleaming in the arena light like a glittering line. The test began. The arena filled with the sounds of the shaking crowd and the sounds of magic. A huge orc appeared, its muscular body covered in dark skin, and every step it took shook the ground, producing a dull rumble. The orc's eyes glowed with an ominous red light. The orc rushed at Bob, his heavy steps shaking the arena like a hammer hitting an anvil. Bob, gathering all his strength, cut the orc in half with one blow, the sword cutting through the air with lightning speed. Shuri was surprised. Her eyes widened in surprise. Bob's eyes were ablaze with a fiery light, emitting a bright glow like hot coals. Bob fought without pause, passing test after test, his movements like lightning flashes in a storm, his every action precise and decisive. His body moved in a dance of battle, not allowing itself the slightest weakening. Each new test only fueled his determination to reach the end. The fighter was kneeling in front of him, his head down. "This is my second defeat," he began, his voice weakening. "If your sword hadn't been worn out, I would have had a harder time," Bob said, touching his head. Bob had overcome him. He stood over his fallen opponent, his breathing even and calm. Finally made it to round 20, Bob thought to himself, his thoughts full of pride. "They don't even let me rest," Bob thought. The air around the hero began to swirl, forming a vortex of magical energy. The gates opened and their heavy doors creaked like ancient steel monsters. Bob used all his skills and his actions were synchronized into a single, rapid flow. The enemy's appearance was terrifying and mysterious. His figure was surrounded by darkness. It moved towards Bob, and every movement it made was like a dark storm moving towards its target. "They overwhelm me even with the strength of giants," Bob thought to himself. Bob was thrown back a little. He felt the ground beneath him shaking. Bob was revealed the snake's true form. His body began to distort and change, turning into a writhing, scaly mass covered in black and pink hues. "What a great opponent," Bob thought to himself, smiling slightly. The serpent was as huge as the sea. Its huge fangs looked like sharp blades ready to tear apart any obstacle, and its eyes emitted a fiery light, like two glowing torches in the night. This light created a feeling of heat and power, ready to defeat any enemy. He charged at Bob, his fangs flashing through the air with terrifying speed. Bob dodged with lightning speed, his body sliding to the side. "I can't make mistakes," Bob thought to himself. Bob began to run like lightning, leaving behind only a shimmering trail. The wind tore through the air around him, creating a sense of relentless power and speed. The snake was about to crush him, and its massive body unfolded like a giant wave. The hero jumped above him and flew over the massive body of the snake as it tried to grab him. Bob concentrated his power into the blade, and his sword glowed with a bright, blinding blue light. He struck out, and the blade cut through the air with a bright flash. The snake dodged, wriggling, using its flexibility and speed. Bob's eyes began to calculate the trajectory, their light becoming more intense. Shuri watched this spectacle, her eyes glued to the arena. She studied every movement of Bob and the snake. Her face remained calm, but inside she was absorbed in what was happening in front of her. The arena was in chaos. The air was filled with sparks and explosions of energy. Every blow and maneuver created a storm of light and shadow. Shuri didn't believe it when she saw it. Her eyes widened in surprise. Bob's burning eyes left a trail behind them like two bright torches. He moved quickly towards the snake, his movements like a quick arrow. He jumped onto the snake, his body sliding over its scales. The protagonist concentrated the power of the giants in his hand, and its muscles tensed to the limit. Shuri tensed, her body frozen in anticipation. Bob aimed for the only place on the snake's body where there were no scales, a thin, vulnerable area hidden among its armor. The power accumulated, creating a magical field around his hand, filled with seething energy. The blade, surrounded by bright light, pierced the vulnerable spot on the snake's body. The snake fell, its massive body collapsing to the ground. Bob pulled the blade from the snake's body like a master completing a complex work. He pulled the sword back and a light cloud of energy like a stream of steam burst out of the wound. The scales, which had recently sparkled, now froze in motionlessness, and the fiery light in his eyes went out. Bob passed the final test and the arena fell silent. Shuri approached him, her steps quiet. "Did you know about the snake's weak spot?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. "No," Bob replied, pointing to his eyes. "I used my powers." "Well, that's interesting," Shuri said, her face expressing respect and interest. "I have something to give you as an additional reward," Shuri said, her voice serious. She reached out to one of her blades. "The manager said to give it to the one who kills the snake," Shuri continued as Bob took the sword in his hands. Bob looked at the blade and his face changed when he noticed that it was broken. "What's going on?" he asked in surprise, his voice full of bewilderment. "Well, okay," thought Bob. "The main prize is the snake's heart." Shuri congratulated Bob, her voice full of genuine approval and joy. "Thank you," Bob said, his voice full of gratitude, looking at Shuri with respect. Suddenly, the egg in Bob's inventory began to complain about hunger, making melodic and insistent sounds. A strange energy enveloped everything around, as if an invisible curtain of light and darkness had enveloped the arena. Shuri tensed up and drew her sword, her movements quick and decisive. This energy began to eat away at the body of the snake. Shuri watched this, her gaze full of surprise and anxiety. She stood motionless. The snake began to lose its shape. Its body began to blur and dissolve in a whirlwind of luminous particles. "He's eating a corpse," Bob said, his words sounding like an admission that what was happening was out of the ordinary. The scales, once sparkling, were now falling apart into pieces, which were being absorbed by a strange energy. The egg, having eaten its fill, began to fall asleep again. "What does this mean?" Bob thought to himself, his mind seething with questions and doubts. Shuri asked, "Do you know what's in the egg, Bob?" A little confused and still worried, replied that he didn't know. "Okay, I won't divulge anything that happened here," Shuri said. "Nice to meet you," Shuri said, and extended her hand in a friendly gesture. Bob, taking her hand, saw her silhouette in the past. They shook hands and said goodbye. A week later, Bob was already taking the maze test. The main character simply broke through the walls and exited the labyrinth. "Time to go to Hephaestus," he muttered, striding forward with determination. Hephaestus watched, sweat dripping down his body, his eyes following every movement. Bob walked into the forge, a slight thrill from the hot air and the sounds of the forge surrounding him. "I came for my order, Uncle," Bob began. "I asked you not to call me Uncle," said Hephaestus. "Wait there, I'll finish soon," he added. "Answer quickly," said Hephaestus, his voice full of animation and interest. "Aren't you hot?" he asked, glancing at Bob. Bob smiled back, his expression calm and confident. Hephaestus, noticing this, asked him how Bob was going to proceed further. "Your blade is ready," Hephaestus said, proudly showing off the completed product. Bob picked up the blade to examine it, his eyes bright with admiration as he ran his fingers over the smooth surface of the blade, testing its balance and edge. "I like it," Bob said, carefully placing it in his inventory. Bob paid for the work, giving Hephaestus the amount they had discussed. Hephaestus accepted the money with gratitude, his face lit up with a satisfied smile. "I'll come again, Uncle," said Bob, his voice full of confidence and friendly warmth. After a while, Bob headed towards the portal, its glowing opening beckoning and attracting him to new adventures. "Finally, I'm going to Miram," Bob thought to himself, his thoughts full of excitement and anticipation. Different people offered to join their guild to new players. They enthusiastically talked about their achievements, opportunities, and advantages. There was a bustle of activity all around, people discussing their plans, noisy groups preparing for the next challenge. No different from a bazaar, Bob noted to himself, watching the bustling activity around him. A character in beautiful clothes approached the hero. His outfit was shiny and shimmering. The character had a sword on his back, exquisitely decorated and clearly of high quality, and he greeted the protagonist with a slight smile. He invited Bob to join his clan, but Bob, without hesitation, responded with a sharp refusal. The character drew his sword, its blade glinting in the sunlight. "Touching a player who has just risen will reflect poorly on the clan's reputation," Bob said, his voice firm and confident.